We can begin, Madam Secretary.
Thank you, Chair Lago. This is the City Planning Commission review session. Today is August 21st. The time is 1:03, and a quorum is present. Commissioners, the first item on the agenda is the proposed Department of City Planning's initiative in the Bronx concerning Jerome Avenue, involving zoning map, zoning text, and city map amendments. We will have a few opening remarks from the chair, followed by Carol Samuel, the director of the Bronx, and our project manager, Michael Parkinson.
I want to note that this is a red letter day. Earlier today, the City Council's Zoning Committee unanimously adopted the downtown Far Rockaway rezoning. It still needs to go to the full Land Use Committee and the full City Council vote, but this was a very significant step that occurred earlier today. I'm extremely pleased, continuing in this vein of neighborhood-based rezonings, to kick off the formal public review of the Jerome Avenue neighborhood plan and concomitant rezoning. I very much want to acknowledge and thank Councilmember Vanessa Gibson, not only for her time and energy in guiding us through the years of planning that went into this, but also for her presence here today. Thank you so much, Council Member. They say that it takes a village, and that is certainly the case when it comes to a neighborhood plan. You'll hear during the presentation the numerous city departments, and city agencies that are involved. But I also wanted to note the 11 different parts of the Department of City Planning that were involved. You'll be hearing today directly from the Bronx office, but they have been backed up by the Environmental Assessment and Review Division, Technical Review, Capital Planning, Urban Design, Transportation, Housing, Economic and Infrastructure Planning, Zoning, Strategic Planning, Intergovernmental, and the Executive Office, all of whom were responsible for bringing this proposal here to you today. And with that, I'll hand it over to Carol.
Thank you. So I guess I wanted to just say a few words of introduction to give some context for the study and the work, and then you'll hear in much greater detail from Michael Parkinson. But to just, and I'm very eager to have you all come out and visit Jerome. Some of you I know have already been there and are already very familiar with the area. But the land use patterns and the uses along the Jerome Avenue corridor are really more than 100 years old. And they date back really when the Bronx itself and that area of the borough was developed. And the 1961 zoning really cemented that, and that is the Jerome Avenue served as a service district to the very dense residential communities that surrounded it along the Grand Concourse, where parking, for example, was not permitted in the residential buildings. And then the train itself emerged, and these uses were developed around it. But that pattern was established and kind of confirmed in the 1961 zoning without ever having anyone look at it and understand how is it meeting the current needs. And certainly, it's never been reconsidered to understand how it's meeting the needs of those who live and work in the area and how their needs have changed. And that's what we're doing here today. The stewards of the community, the local community boards, and elected officials have asked us to look at the zoning along these corridors for many years. Community Board 5 has been inquiring about Jerome and the broader needs of the community, really looking at the overall community. Since the early 2000s, they've wanted us to look at this, understanding that it is outdated. And Community Board 4 has been asking for a study of this area since the late 2000s. So we're here today in a long-desired process. And even during the process, Community Board 5 and Councilmember Cabrera requested that we extend the study to include more of the area because they wanted us to think holistically about even more of the community. All of those with a desire to see this area of the districts better meet the needs of the current residents and stakeholders. And finally, I would say, we've been working on this plan for more than 3 years. There's been a public process and engagement that we've been thinking about. We've had a robust process that Michael will talk through here with more than 40 outreach events, and those will continue. In English and in Spanish, we've been very respectful of the community to really try to get opinions in large group meetings and small group meetings, one-on-one. Everything from naming the issues, voting on the plan goals, prioritizing recommendations and strategies has been done with the community. And of course, as Chair Lago mentioned, we're not in this alone. It's a multifaceted plan. It calls for very strong interagency collaboration, including housing preservation and development, transportation, parks and recreation, small business services, health, the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs, the Mayor's Office of Workforce Development, the Mayor's Office of Environmental Remediation, and the Department of Environmental Protection, and many others. Community Boards 4 and 5 have been very important planning partners with us. Councilmember Vanessa Gibson and Councilmember Fernando Cabrera have provided leadership and vision throughout, really holding our feet to the fire. Local stakeholders and CBOs, including the Davidson Community Center and WEDCO, are already deeply engaged in implementing the plan, even as we're shaping it. We're pleased to start the formal public review of the land use process and look forward to continuing the planning work throughout the ULURP. Now I am pleased to turn it over to Michael Parkinson, Senior Project Manager for the Jerome Avenue Neighborhood Plan.
Good afternoon, Commissioners, and thank you for your time and attention here as I walk through the Jerome Avenue Neighborhood Plan. And thank you, Carol, for that introduction. Carol said a word in her introduction, which I hope bears out throughout the course of this presentation, and that was holistic. She just went through all of the agency partners and community partners and local stakeholders we've been working closely with throughout this process. And I really hope that shows through in the presentation this afternoon. So first, I'll provide a little introduction, what the plan is, what you should expect to hear today. Walk through a little bit of the neighborhood context, not only physically and geographically, but also talk about the people, the demographics, the social side. Talk through the plan and process. As Carol had mentioned, we've been doing this for nearly 3 years at this point. So sort of walking you through how we got to where we're at today, and then ultimately, what are the draft recommendations that we've come to through this planning process, and of those, specifically, what are the land use actions we're here to certify today. So the Jerome Avenue Neighborhood Plan is really more than a sum of its parts. Certainly the lenses through which we've been doing our planning work include housing, community resources, jobs and businesses, access, mobility, circulation, and of course zoning and land use. But none of these things have been thought about in isolation. And in fact, as they all come together, really do fulfill the vision of the future of the Jerome Avenue neighborhood corridor. So next, discussing a little bit of the neighborhood context and where the study area actually sits. The study area itself is about a 2-mile stretch along Jerome Avenue in the southwest Bronx. Just to sort of give you a little bit of context here, the study area sits just east of Bronx Community College in the north, just east of the recently opened and fabulous, if I may say so, High Bridge, and just a couple of blocks north of Yankee Stadium to the south. It passes through Community Boards 4, 5, as well as a little bit of 7, although the majority of the study area are included in Community Boards 4 and 5. And as you can see through these images, just to show a little bit of the corridor's context. Really, it's a thin corridor that travels, as I mentioned, over 2 miles, and it is surrounded by residential communities and residential development. There are many neighborhoods throughout the Jerome Avenue corridor, and the planning work that we've initiated here really touches many of them. And these include University Heights and Morris Heights to the north, as well as High Bridge, Concourse, Mount Eden to the south. And as you can see in these images, just show a little bit about the differing context. The top image is Edward L. Grant Highway, which is just west off of the corridor, predominantly residential in character. And then when you move east to along the corridor, predominantly commercial uses along Jerome Avenue, which I'll speak to a little more specifically later in the presentation. As far as the people, the demographics here are largely made up of a Latino population, African American population. This is a large immigrant community in communities. There are over 100,000 Latino immigrants in the communities along Jerome Avenue. Over 77,000 of those are Dominicans. And there's also a large and growing West African population. In fact, one of the largest and fastest growing African immigrant groups anywhere in the city are located in the corridor itself. Household incomes here are lower than the city as a whole or the borough itself, and hover around $26,000. And the health outcomes that are suffered in these communities are oftentimes negative. The health lens is one that has been instilled in us to really take the forefront in all of the planning work we're doing, be it land use, public realm, workforce and economic development. We've really been told and learned very fast that health is a prime concern and a prime topic when we're doing our planning work. As far as the physical geography, Jerome Avenue is a transit corridor. The elevated 4 train that runs throughout the study area is certainly one of the defining physical characteristics, but it is also flanked by the BD trains just to the east that run beneath the Grand Concourse. As far as some of the auto-centric infrastructure, the Major Deegan is located west just off of the Harlem River, and the Cross Bronx Expressway at this point is a depressed portion of the expressway and literally cuts through community boards 4 and 5 and sort of severs that continuity along Jerome Avenue. So certainly a challenge and hurdle to think about in our planning work. The land uses. The neighborhoods that surround Jerome Avenue are largely residential. In fact, over 70% of the land uses in the neighborhoods that surround Jerome Avenue are residential, and the housing types that make up this land use are predominantly multifamily apartment buildings, walk-ups and elevator apartments. Although I will mention there are some pockets of lower scale 1 and 2 unit developments, majority of which are multifamily. This sticks in stark contrast to the rezoning area itself, which are made largely of mixed use, commercial office, and auto-related uses. I would point out here that auto-related uses, while many conjure the image of the auto shop when they think of Jerome Avenue, and rightly so, they are a highly visible use. But again, in terms of land uses, they make up about 15% of the primary study area or rezoning area. And this is reflected in the zoning. As Carol mentioned in her introduction, these are uses, a service corridor that really sprung up in response to the densification and building up of the surrounding neighborhoods. And Jerome Avenue itself did serve as sort of the service corridor to these neighborhoods. This was then formally codified into the zoning in 1961, where the C8 districts and the M districts along the corridor have really frozen these land uses in place. And through our study, we're now taking a fresh look at the land uses along the corridor to think through what the most appropriate uses are, not only for 2017, but beyond, as we recognize our city is growing and our borough is growing fastest among any other borough. And as I mentioned, the residential nature of the surrounding land uses, I'd be remiss to mention housing affordability. In these neighborhoods that surround Jerome Avenue, we see some of the highest rates of rent-regulated housing units of anywhere in the city. Over 2/3 of housing units in the neighborhoods that surround Jerome Avenue are protected in some form or another, be it government assistance, public housing, or rent stabilization. And I would also mention that since 2003, the Department of Housing Preservation and Development, one of our key partners in this initiative, have invested tremendously in these areas, building or preserving over 15,000 units of affordable housing. But what does all this mean for the ground? What does this look like when you're actually in the place? As I mentioned, the elevated rail, to many, really defines this corridor, and it's the first thing one might think about when they think about Jerome Avenue. But what we've learned through this process and what has become so evident to us, that really the defining characteristic of these communities are the people. While a diverse range of perspectives and opinions, I assure you, there is a common thread in that when you talk to the folks in these communities and you do your planning work alongside them, their care and love of their communities really shines through. And that's something we hope that we're being respectful of and something we take to heart in the planning work we're doing. But there are also tremendous physical assets in the area. Just west of Jerome Avenue corridor is the recently opened High Bridge, a phenomenal pedestrian connection between Washington Heights and Manhattan and the High Bridge neighborhood of the Bronx, providing not only access to the A and C train on the Washington Heights side and the 4 train on the Bronx side, but also some of the most breathtaking vistas, for my money, anywhere in the city. Just north at the Aqueduct Walk. Aqueduct Walk is a linear park that spans between Kingsbridge Road to the north and Burnside Avenue to the south, just west of Jerome Avenue, and is actually built upon the Croton Aqueduct. It provides a much-needed linear connection, a linear pedestrian connection through the University Heights neighborhood of the Bronx. The Bronx Community College, one of the finest institutions we have in the borough, and one of the finest examples of urban architecture and campus architecture really anywhere in the city. And when one thinks of architecture, of course, you have to think of the Grand Concourse and the Art Deco apartments that line the marvelous Grand Concourse that flanks Jerome Avenue just to a short walk to the east. The corridor itself, however, as I mentioned, is a predominantly 1- and 2-story commercial corridor. You can see from this image the residential makeup and character of the neighborhoods. And I stopped the presentation. Oh, here we go, okay. Just to the west of the corridor as well as to the east, but along the majority of the corridor itself are these commercial uses, these low-scale commercial uses. And Jerome Avenue is a valley. One thing I didn't mention that I should have earlier are the step streets. This photograph is taken not from a window of an apartment building, but from one of the really unique pedestrian amenities and assets that are found throughout the corridor, and those are the step streets that connect Jerome Avenue itself with some of the higher neighborhoods that do surround it. And I hope it's evident in this photograph as well, just the residential character of the surrounding context. And albeit a variety of housing types, the overwhelming condition is multifamily apartment buildings. The corridor itself, however, a stark contrast. Here's an example of 1-story commercial uses built literally right next to the transit station. So where transit accessibility is literally the most prominent, the land uses are not reflective of being able to capitalize on that asset in its current form today. The corridor is also lined with auto uses and garage uses. And oftentimes these land uses do have quality of life issues associated with them and issues that affect the pedestrian realm, such as cars parked on the sidewalks, some of the work spilling out onto the sidewalks, which is not only an issue from a pedestrian standpoint, but also an indication that the land uses today may not serve the businesses in the way that they need them to be served. Jenny Jerome Park. This is an example of some of the recent investment that's taken place in the corridor throughout the years. Jenny Jerome Park was the beneficiary of CPI, the CPI initiative, the Community Parks Initiative, which was a program established in 2014 to really provide physical upgrades to parks in traditionally and historically underserved areas. This work at Jenny Jerome Park has been completed, but I would also mention that 2 other parks in the area, Walton Park in University Heights, as well as Ogden Plimpton Park in Highbridge, are also in the midst of their own CPI processes, and construction on those open spaces should begin shortly as well. Again, another image of the step street connecting the Jerome Avenue Valley to the surrounding residential uses. But again, the elevated train really defines this corridor. Be it from a top or below, the forward train and the access it provides is really a defining characteristic. Here, the Cross Bronx Expressway, as I mentioned earlier, cuts through laterally both community boards 4 and 5. And you can see Jerome Avenue and the elevated rail that literally has to bridge across it, which presents a unique planning challenge for us to think about. Pedestrian realm is challenging in this corridor. Some of that is due to the land uses I mentioned, but some of it is simply due to lack of appropriate infrastructure. But as all of this demonstrates, I think, is that there are a tremendous amount of issues and opportunities in this area. And really, this gave us the springboard for the planning study that we undertook in concert with local elected officials, local stakeholders, and of course, residents themselves. And that's what I'd like to talk to you a little bit more about now, is the actual planning process and how we got here based on all of those conditions and what we've learned from the work. So as Carol mentioned, we started this process formally launching in September 2014. So almost 3 years to the month we began this work. And has gone through iterations of public outreach, be it goal-setting workshops, visioning events, releasing zoning framework, prepping the community, I should say, for environmental review, and brings us here today to certify the land use proposal. So we started with data gathering and analysis, as many planning studies do. We made sure to feed that information that we were learning on the ground back to the community constantly to ensure that what we were understanding and what we were learning was accurate. This is actually Councilmember Gibson's tenant council meeting. This would have been 2 or 3 years ago now, and we learned tremendously through these small group meetings, which really set the stage for us to more formally feed back to the public through a series of open houses and information sessions, really feeding back the existing conditions as we understood them. And through these, the information sharing workshops, we were able to really start to define issues formally with the community. From there, was able to launch a goal setting workshop. So we took in all of the issues that we learned about the area through all the work we've been doing and conversations we've been having with the community to formally actually setting goals and then voting on them and prioritizing those goals that would essentially set the foundation for the planning work that we're doing. And I'll share those goals with you in a little bit here. From the goal setting workshop, we stepped into visioning. So the goals were a very broad look at what are the plethora of issues and opportunities in the neighborhood. And then the visioning was essentially, well, how do we make these work for the actual physicality aspect, the physical aspects of the space and the land uses and zoning that tie in so intimately with those goals and issues. And so through this workshop, we were able to really define a zoning framework and get the feedback we needed to add to our professional lens and expertise to map out what we believed were the appropriate zoning districts for the Jerome Avenue corridor. And then we shared those. This is our zoning framework being shared in November 2015. So this has been around for a while, and we've had plenty of opportunities to opine and talk through exactly the goals of the zoning framework and learn from people their reactions to the zoning framework for quite some time. That being said, the zoning itself, as you all well know, is not the most simple process. There are complexities involved with it, and we wanted to make sure that we were bringing the community along with us as we were preparing for things like environmental review, making sure that the public really understood that our door was always open to answer any questions or concerns that they had about the process and about the agenda of the city and what we were really planning. From there, we did a number of summer tabling events. This was a prioritization exercise that we undertook last summer, really laying out all the possibilities of strategies and recommendations and asking people, in a world where there are limited resources, where would you put your dollars? Where do you put your priorities in crafting recommendations, which really helped us understand, again, the priorities of the community and how they aligned with the land use and zoning goals. But of course, our interest doesn't stop at a zoning map, and we've done tremendous work. This is a charrette that we were joined with Department of Transportation, Department of Parks and Recreation, as well as the Department of Health to talk about that Cross Bronx interchange that I mentioned earlier. The Cross Bronx and Jerome Avenue interchange is a really unique and challenging piece of infrastructure where the Cross Bronx entrance and exit ramps meet Jerome Avenue itself, and really there's some creative thinking that needs to get done. So of course, we were looking to do that with the community and thus the charrette. And then more recently is this summer. As you can see here, we've started to map out our recommendations and start to think through how these strategies really lay out across the corridor and ask people to comment on them and to let us know what they think about them as we're preparing to enter environmental review. And in fact, I think we still have a couple of these exercises that we'll be doing, entering the formal land use review process. But we have more of these exercises that will be happening even after certification. So it's something, of course, we're dedicated to, and what we've always said is that the recommendations and strategies that are associated with the plan don't necessarily start or stop with ULURP. These are all things that work together to really create the vision of the place. So with that, I'd like to shift gears and talk about the planning recommendations and goals that I'd mentioned earlier. Really, we set up 5 buckets, for lack of a better word, into how we think about the goals and vision for the corridor. And these buckets or categories are housing, economic and workforce development, parks, open space and transportation, community resources, and of course, land use and zoning. So the goals for housing are to provide sustainable and high quality affordable housing at a range of incomes. one of the things that we've always said from the start of our process is that economic diversity and the highest quality of affordable housing are important to the work that we'll be doing. But just as, if not more important, is the protection of tenants and the improvement of housing quality. The goals for economic and workforce development include creating opportunities for more diverse retail, support of the auto-related businesses and workers along the corridor, the promotion of small business and entrepreneurship, regardless of building type, and of course, helping residents in area and local community members prepare for jobs and career growth with appropriate training and skills development opportunities. Parks, open space, and transportation, the goals that we reached with the community, and of course in concert with our sister agencies, are to guarantee that every neighborhood has green streetscapes and quality parks, ensure that these quality open spaces are within a 10-minute walk of the community, or of any one resident, to promote safe and walkable conditions along Jerome Avenue underneath that elevated train, and to make sure that the streets are safe and attractive for everyone, folks of all mobility concerns, be it able-bodied or pushing strollers or wheeling chairs. Community resources, really sort of a broader look at the neighborhoods at large, but these include meeting the educational, health, and service needs of the communities along Jerome Avenue, as well as just generally improving quality of life and health. Again, using those lenses as sort of a paramount screen for all of the work we're doing. So from all of these, we drafted key strategies. The first, I'll walk you through some of the public realm strategies that are associated with the Jerome Avenue neighborhood plan. And these include, first and foremost, creating a better environment underneath the elevated rail along Jerome Avenue. Working closely with Department of Transportation to ensure that the streetscape along Jerome Avenue is conducive to a streetscape that is cohesive and continuous and attractive. Improving streetscapes along major corridors like Edward L. Grant, which is a major connection between Jerome Avenue and the University Heights neighborhood just north of the Cross Bronx as it travels along the High Bridge neighborhood. Strengthening retail corridors throughout the district. So Jerome Avenue, of course, is a 2-mile north-south stretch of a corridor, but throughout it, at 167th Street, at 170th Street, at Mount Eden, Tremont Avenue, Burnside Avenue, and 183rd Street are all lateral connections that are mapped with commercial uses today that serve as connections between the neighborhoods to the west, Jerome Avenue, and then beyond to the Grand Concourse. As well as improving the underpasses. So the same corridors, as they pass, or as they come up to the Grand Concourse, actually pass underneath it in many cases, and in some of the areas actually provide connections to the B and D train at those stations. But today they're largely in disrepair and could use beautification and improvements. Same goes for the step streets. As I mentioned earlier, the step streets are a unique asset, and we really do think of them as an asset here. But ones that need a fresh look and make sure that they are performing to the standards that we would expect for any neighborhood in the city. And of course, the Cross Bronx Expressway interchange. How do we improve pedestrian safety as well as knit together some of the open spaces that are mapped and used right along that interchange? It really is an interesting and unique confluence of these factors that come together. But making sense out of them all and investing in them is something that we'll need to do to ensure that that gap is literally bridged between the community boards. And of course, advocate for accessibility along the transit lines. There are no escalator or elevator services available between 161st Street and Fordham Road on either of these lines. So doing what we can in this planning process to best advocate for accessibility along the lines will be important. And then finally, mapping appropriate zoning districts to really bring all of these public realm strategies together and bring the vibrancy and density to the street where they belong, and to map these densities along the transit corridors to really stitch these all together. And I would note that yesterday, in my last minute attempt to make sure everything was all in order and perfect, I accidentally deleted a slide that's in open spaces. And surely I would be remiss if I didn't mention capitalizing on key and strategic open spaces, be it Aqueduct Park to the north, Corporal Fisher Park in the Highbridge neighborhood, which I'll talk to a little bit more in more detail in the future. And then Grant Park, just south of 170th Street, east of the Grand Concourse, we all feel are phenomenal opportunities to be explored for the improvement and enhancement of open spaces. As far as strategies related to housing, really it's a multi-pronged approach. It's building new housing, it is preserving existing housing, and it is protecting tenants. Certainly the land use actions that we'll be learning a little bit more about here today are in line with the production of new affordable housing units. And in fact, one of the things that we often hear from folks is, you know, I qualify for that building and I've applied, but I just can't get in. And that's a story you hear over and over and over again, which is a clear indication to us that there's a lack of supply and something needs to be done to provide more opportunities for affordable new construction, which we believe this project is taking the steps toward doing. But preservation, as I mentioned earlier, really the key component, the housing component or housing strategy in this project is preservation. Over 2/3 of the existing housing units in the neighborhoods that surround Jerome Avenue are rent protected. So working with HPD to make sure they stay that way, and having HPD proactively reach out to any property owner whose regulatory or affordability agreement is set to expire in the coming years is something that they have been feverishly pursuing, and in fact have targeted over 100 properties to be included in their preservation initiative. I can let them speak to the exact phrasing of exactly what the program is. But the point is that we're doubling down on preservation efforts and really making sure that property owners have access to the information they need and the resources they need to maintain their affordable properties. And in fact, I would also mention that HPD's recently launched their Landlord Ambassador Program and has enlisted local community group Northwest Bronx Community and Clergy Coalition to help property owners navigate that space to ensure that they have access to the resources they need to ensure affordability. And then finally, tenant support. So the units are one thing, which are certainly a driving force behind this plan, but the people that live in the units are arguably the most important. And making sure that they're protected, the quality of housing that they are subject to is of the highest quality possible, it is paramount. Within the last 2 years, the tenant support unit of HRA has knocked down thousands of doors and opened thousands of cases for tenant support, and have in fact, they've been able to support nearly 3,000 tenants just within the last 2 years alone. And likewise, the HPD has been doing block sweeps of distressed properties, making sure that anytime there's an issue with the quality of housing, going through to do detailed assessments of those properties. They've visited over 400 to date. They've opened detailed surveys on over 90 of them, and in fact have taken then a number of those, or they've pursued active litigation. So really taking landlords to task and making sure that everybody here understands what is lawful and legal and what is expected of them. And then economic development as a strategy. Certainly the auto businesses and workers along the corridor are an incredibly important stakeholder group for this planning process. Albeit 15% of the land uses along the corridor are auto related, that doesn't in any way diminish the importance of this sector of the economy. So doing everything we can to support those workers, be it access to increased training opportunities and education opportunities, or supporting those businesses by making sure that they have the connections they need to the already robust suite of city programs that the Department of Small Business Services provides, including lease negotiation, including business planning, among many others. And this sort of dovetails with work we're doing on the workforce side, along with SBS, but also the Mayor's Office of Workforce Development, Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs, and the Department of Health. We've begun to convene a series of meetings with a number of local CBOs in the area to really suss out what is the best way for these actors to be referring locally, to be connecting and forming a network locally, and to be connecting their constituents with job opportunities at a local level as they come online. We've worked with, there have been over 20 organizations represented, from some of the tenant organizers that we work with to some of the employers like Bronx Lebanon Hospital, Montefiore, but also community organizations and educational institutions. Davidson Community Center and WEDCO come to mind. Bronx Community College comes to mind. But what's clear in all of this is there's already a robust set of these organizations working. And if they all sort of got on the same page, and some of them already are, certainly, but how can we strengthen their networks to really increase the synergy throughout them all? And then the last strategy I'll mention is the Neighborhood 360 work undertaken by the Department of Small Business Services. This has been a phenomenal program that has been undertaken, and many of the components already implemented that have looked at the entirety of the commercial landscape for all of the land uses along Jerome Avenue, done detailed survey work and interviews with merchants and residents along the corridor to really figure out, well, what are the biggest issues and opportunities from a retail landscape perspective that we can tap into through this process. Through that work, and this is the cover of that assessment, so this was the Commercial District Needs Assessment that was published. Through that work, the city has recently granted nearly $1 million to local organizations, Davidson Community Center and WEDCO, to start implementing some of the recommendations that came out of that plan. So these include things like merchant organizing, placemaking, and improvements in the public realm, and identity programs, shop local programs. And it's really been an incredible effort, and that we're excited to see all of these next steps as they continue to unfold. And this leads us to the planning recommendations. So, of course, we think of zoning and land use as recommendations, just like the public realm, housing, or economic development. And that's what I'll be talking through and what we'll be certifying at today's meeting. And so the goals of the land use category of the planning effort are to create zoning districts that are conducive to fulfilling the vision of Jerome Avenue, to focus distinct nodes of density where appropriate, and to leave strategic areas zoned for their current uses in an effort to maintain some of that economic diversity that we see along the corridor. And again, the reasons that we're undertaking the zoning component of this study are because there are issues that we feel are brought upon by the current zoning and land uses. This includes the prohibition of residential uses. And as we were trying to promote affordable housing development as a key part of this study, one of the things we understand is that lack of sites is becoming an increasing impediment to new construction. Where districts don't currently permit residential uses, looking to rezone those so that they can. The land uses have occasionally negative or detrimental effects on quality of life. There are commercial use limitations, which I'll speak to in a little bit more detail, at Burnside and Tremont Avenues. And there are difficulties for development imposed by irregular lots that are found throughout the study area, as well as the elevated rail infrastructure itself. So as I mentioned, pardon me, the existing zoning is really predominantly residential, with the majority of zoning districts being mapped as R7 districts or R8 districts today. The difference, of course, is the corridor itself. The zoning in 1961 really locked in the land use of the heavy commercial and light industrial uses that we see along the corridor today. So all of these things together, we formed a zoning framework that really is sort of derived from a number of factors. First of which is promoting development along or at the stations, right? Mapping nodes of density at the convergence of wide streets where there are real opportunities to create places. Promote opportunities along major corridors, be it Edward L. Grant, 170th Street, or McCombs Road to the south, or Burnside Avenue to the north. Where are these wide, prominent streets mapping appropriate residential districts and commercial overlays to match? And speaking of Burnside and Tremont, mapping a full commercial district here. For anyone that's been up to these retail corridors today, they'll tell you these are very vibrant and lively retail corridors, but ones that we feel have so much more potential. And by mapping a full commercial district, we hope to realize that over the next several years. And then all throughout, sort of stitching all of these strategies together by mapping mid-density residential districts along the entirety of the corridor, again with commercial uses and non-residential ground floor uses, to really create that cohesiveness along Jerome Avenue itself. And then to maintain existing zoning at key locations. As I mentioned, there is an economic vitality and vibrancy in a lot of the commercial uses along the corridor, and proposing zoning districts that really respect that is a key component of our zoning framework. And as I mentioned, mapping a special district here that really would allow for flexibility and new rules for lots fronting elevated rail, as well as some of the irregular lots. So the land use actions in total that we're here to certify today are zoning text amendments, mapping the special Jerome Avenue district, as well as mandatory inclusionary housing districts. Zoning map amendments that will range from between R7A to R9A residential districts, and to demap Corporal Fisher Place, which, as I'll speak to in a little greater detail later, is an unbuilt street that sits adjacent to property currently in possession or in ownership of the Parks Department, so creating opportunities for parkland by demapping Corporal Fisher Place. So as I mentioned, the special district will be mapped coterminous with the zoning map amendments of this of the proposed zoning map amendments, and it'll really do four things. One, it'll institute lower base heights along the elevated rail, ensuring that no development that fronts the elevated rail will have a base height higher than 2 stories or 30 feet, and at that point would require a 10-foot setback before rising to its maximum height. And I would also mention here that we're allowing an additional 2 stories of height for lots fronting the elevated rail, really to make up for the loss of square footage that we're now requiring based on the lower base height. We've done several zoning tests with this, and what we learned is we probably didn't need to increase the height, but what would happen is you would get these very tight boxes with no architectural variety or articulation, and by allowing a little additional height, really would promote architectural flexibility in much better buildings. The same sort of logic applies to the irregularly shaped lots, ensuring that we are relaxing street wall requirements and providing height waivers where the development of actual building architecture, block and plank architecture, would be able to be realized in these challenging lots. And then the special district will also map a hotel, or will include a hotel special permit requiring that hotel development will be made to receive a special permit before the housing goals of the study have been met. And we'll map mandatory ground floor uses throughout the commercial corridors, ensuring active ground floor uses. So the first thing I'll mention in terms of the actual districts, we are proposing R7A and R7D mid-density residential districts along the corridor with commercial overlays. Today, the surrounding character is largely of R7 character. The corridor itself is largely C8 districts and would be allowed residential densities between 4.6 in the R7A and 5.6 in the R7D. Showing you the current condition of the corridor itself. Underdeveloped land uses that don't match the potential for being right adjacent, literally, to one of the major transit thoroughfares in the city. Again, 1-story commercial next to a Jerome Avenue. But just off the corridor again, multifamily apartment buildings. What we're mapping really does fit this context and this character. In addition to the R7A districts, we'll be mapping, this just goes to show the sort of current condition, and then by bringing that neighborhood character literally to the train station, what can be achievable, not only through the land use actions and subsequent development, but also public realm improvements and safety improvements at the streets. We'll be proposing R8A districts along major corridors, including Edward L. Grant, which today is an R71 corridor, and 170th Street, as well as McCombs Road, and mapping contextual districts where where R8 districts already exist today at 183rd Street, at Mount Eden, as well as 167th Street. So again, the residential FARs that are allowed in the R8s today are already 7.2. We'd be mapping R8A with overlays that would be able to achieve up to 7.2 residential FARs with heights of 145 feet away from the elevated rail and 165 feet along the elevated rail. Here's a photo, as I mentioned, Edward L. Grant, mapped as R71 today, but as you can see, really would stand to benefit from added opportunity for increased density. Along the corridor, the 1 to 2 story commercial uses. This image I wanted to spend just a second on because I think it's indicative of the transit richness, really, of the neighborhoods, not only along the 4 train, but also along the BD. This photograph is taken from 170th Street, looking west down to Jerome Avenue. And as you can see, this is right where the 170th Street BD stop is. It's approximately 2 to 3 minute walk between those corridors. And this is where the Grand Concourse is at its furthest from Jerome Avenue. So really thinking about not only the 4 train, but also the BD as such crucial connections via mass transit. And again, the wide streets where they come together, mapped next to predominantly residential districts today, we feel are appropriate matches of this character. So today, where there are these voids where the land uses don't match the potential of the area, by mapping land uses that would, we could really see the creation of places in the added vibrancy and vitality of new units and new opportunities in the area. As I mentioned earlier, full commercial district up at Burnside Avenue and Tremont Avenue. We're proposing a C4 4D district, which would have commercial FARs of 3.4. But I should mention that this district is also an R8A equivalent, matching again the R8 character of the surrounding neighborhoods. This photograph is of Burnside Avenue, showing you it is a vital and vibrant retail corridor. But as Bronx Community College sits just at the other end of it, Fordham Road just north, and Grand Concourse just to the east, with the Burnside Avenue stop and Tremont Avenue BD stop right there, we feel has just a tremendous potential for a full commercial district in the future. Again, surrounding context, multifamily residential buildings. And again, bringing this, or mapping a commercial district today with the elevated rules, creating responsive building envelopes that respond to the elevated rail, really can do a lot to bolster this corridor and provide the vision for the Burnside Avenue and Tremont Avenue connections into the future. And then lastly, I'll discuss the mapping of our highest density proposal, R9A. As you can see from the overall zoning map, we're mapping it very judiciously, just at 2 spots in the southern portion of the rezoning area. The northern of which is really an important fulcrum. Really, it's the knot that connects the Edward L. Grant Highway with 170th Street, just a block or 2 off of that 170th Street 4 train stop. That, coupled with the topography and available sites in the area, really make it appropriate for this level of density, we believe. And then down further to the south, you have connections not only to the 167th Street 4 train, but this is just blocks north of Yankee Stadium and the 161st Street Metro North Mass Transit Station. And then off of the corridor, you have the confluence of many wide streets. You have Edward L. Grant Highway, Cromwell Avenue, and Jerome Avenue all coming together. In really what is shown here is, if Jerome Avenue itself is a valley, this is really the bowl of that valley. And again, presents opportunities for increased residential development through this land use proposal. And again, the sort of future look at fulfilling the vision of the Jerome Avenue corridor with mapping these districts in mind. And then finally, leaving areas maintained for their current zoning designations of M1 and C8 districts. There are 4 unique clusters of these zoning designations that we are electing to maintain zoned as is through, and is an important part of our overall zoning framework. As I mentioned throughout, we will be proposing C24 commercial overlays, again, mapped along with the residential uses to create that continuity and cohesiveness, not only along Jerome Avenue, but along where some of the other major corridors, including Edward L. Grant, where commercial overlays are not mapped today. And all of this gets us to the proposed zoning map. And then when we think about that as it corresponds with the public realm improvements and other strategies that we discussed today, really, we really believe that all of these things work together to create the vision as defined by the Jerome Avenue Neighborhood Plan. So again, there are zoning text amendments associated with this application. We'll be mapping a special district that has the rules for lots against the elevated rail, as well as the irregular lot allowances, hotel special permit, and active ground floor uses. And we will be mapping mandatory inclusionary housing in any area where we are increasing the residential capacity over what is currently zoned there today. And then finally, the city map change is the last action I'll discuss today. I mentioned earlier that there is an unbuilt street that is adjacent to a city-owned lot. We are proposing to demap that street, combine it with the adjacent lot to create parkland just off of the Edward L. Grant Highway. And I would mention too that this is a really key location as it sits right in the middle between the recently opened High Bridge as well as the 170th station. So it's, again, just adding to that rhythm of the corridor and bolstering the corridors that really knit these communities together. Transforming a vacant plot of land that anybody can walk by and really think, well, shouldn't that be in X, Y, or Z? And turning it into mapped parkland for the future opportunities to create really great open spaces. Our environmental review did indicate significant adverse impacts in construction, shadows, transportation, and community facilities. I would also mention that throughout our public process and at our scoping hearing, we were asked to study in our environmental review a number of other properties. So if you'll see in your DEIS, there is an expanded area alternative. We have undergone those studies to ensure that any discussions throughout the public review process will remain in scope. So again, the Jerome Avenue Neighborhood Plan really is more than a sum of its parts. We hope that we demonstrated some of the detail, but also the breadth of the planning work that has been done, is ongoing, and will continue far long after the land use actions are voted on. To really transform the corridor from what it is today to an area where housing opportunities are abundant, key stations are mapped with land uses and subsequently improved in the public realm to bolster access, to create connections between key institutions like Bronx Community College and the neighborhoods around it, and as well as to shape buildings to respond to the constraints that are around them today. And those, coupled with pedestrian safety and public realm improvements, will all create the vision for the Jerome Avenue corridor as outlined by the plan. So at this point, I'm happy to answer any questions, and I thank you for your time.
And thank you, Michael, for a tour de force of a presentation. Questions from commissioners? Commissioner Dweck.
Thank you. So on the public realm improvements and the transit accessibility improvements, who's paying for it, and has the money been allocated, and what's the vision on timeline?
Sure. Well, what we've always said through this process is that we're using our process to best highlight the issues as we can. Certainly, no money has been allocated or specific plans derived, but we do have a communication with the MTA, and we are pursuing whatever we can do to ensure that we are making accessibility improvements where practicable.
And one more question. So obviously, we haven't had the public hearing yet. What are the public concerns that you're anticipating on this, or the?
Sure, I would say chief among them will be affordability. And what we hear a lot of is that the programs that the city is able to employ in terms of affordable housing development don't match the incomes in the neighborhoods today. I will defer to HPD to discuss their new term sheets, but now more than ever are our term sheets able to reach the deepest affordabilities while maintaining economic diversity.
So in general, you're saying that the opponents are for the rezoning, but the affordability levels are the main concern right now. I'm not asking you to speak
Sure.
to the public, but from what you've heard.
Well, I would characterize generally by saying that the opposition is largely about affordability and also commercial activity along the corridor. As far as a pro or against rezoning, with the caveat of if we can get affordabilities lower, we will support it. We haven't had really those explicit conversations, but I will say that when we released our zoning framework, I had conversations with many of the tenant advocates and organizers who did sort of say to me in sidebars, we really do think that this is the right approach. However, we need to make sure to take care of X, Y, and Z.
And-
So,
and-
go
okay.
ahead.
And lastly, because Commissioner Ortiz is not here today, I'll ask the retail question for her. What do you envision the retail vibrancy being in the new commercial?
Sure. Well, so, one of the things that we've heard regarding retail throughout this study is just the need for greater diversity. These are, by and large, pretty healthy retail corridors today. Where we do see retail uses, we see them at a vacancy rate of less than 5%, which is, far better than the city's average. But we also see that coupled with statistics of, $1 billion in leakage leaving these neighborhoods every year. And the residents themselves acknowledging that for certain items, they can't shop locally because the local retail doesn't provide them with the opportunity.
Do you envision any opposition to, I would say, I wouldn't call it big box, but bigger stores, or?
We've heard that as a concern, although I would point out that the types of lots and development sites that we really have in the C44D district wouldn't necessarily lend themselves to a big box store to begin with. So the spatial constraint sort of is able to quell that issue.
Thank you. Thank you.
Vice Chair Knuckles.
Thank you. Again, excellent presentation, Mr. Parkinson. I see Carol and her team as well. There's some faces in here that I worked with in the late 1980s. The Bronx is still engaged in planning. You can always count on that. Along the Jerome Avenue corridor with the car shops and there, you have an approximation of the jobs that are there, the number of jobs, number one. And number two, is there any thinking around how those businesses might be relocated in wake of rezoning, when some of those landlords would likely want to capitalize on a higher value real estate?
Sure. So let me answer the second question. The numbers I don't have right. Do you have But the second answer is really, this is a process in a zoning proposal that we really do see playing out over a long period of time. This is the future vision. As you all know, zoning does take time. So our primary focus is making sure that we're providing the jobs and workers in the auto sector the connections to the services that they need today. But whether or not that would entail wholesale relocation or anything like that is just not something that we would see being needed through this process, as it will take time and unfold over many, many years. In terms of jobs.
Yeah, so just some of the numbers. I mean, I would, to your question, Commissioner, too, I think the auto will be a major point of discussion throughout this process. We're trying to be prepared to have this discussion about where and how to support and preserve these uses in the corridor. But overall, there's, it's a very diverse economy here. We've got 544 businesses, according to the environmental review, about 3,500 employees right in the corridor itself. But beyond that, it is a much bigger economy in the broader area. 2,100 businesses, 18,000 employees. I mean, this is a city here in and of itself. In these two community boards.
Right. On page 64, is that an actual building, or is that a prototype where you've got
I think that's a rendering.
That's a rendering.
I think
It is a rendering,
yeah.
but it's a rendering of a proposed project, I believe.
Right. So, was there any feedback on this kind of density and height mid-block?
Not that I've been made aware of, but I would point out that those are, that a project like that would be built to the current zoning. So the exact location of where that is either in an R7 or an R8 district. So that's representative of as of right development.
Okay.
Commissioner Arpa.
Thank you. So one of the uses that I know of in this area that perhaps is underrepresented in discussions because they're not aggregated is smaller nonprofits running community services that are really kind of the heart and soul of this neighborhood that, as you've mentioned, really is in need. I visited the largest daycare center I've ever seen, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of children run by a Catholic organization, but a very small one. Is the department focused on the possible displacement of those nonprofits from their locations very close to transit as the development takes place? And are we sure that the rezoning is creating the proper incentives for more community use?
So no, I don't think we are worried about the displacement of those uses. I think that one of the things we've always said is that the community facility use and the community use in general is so critical to the lifeblood of this neighborhood. And that coupled with what we understand, not to speak for HPD, but what we understand about difficulties sometimes in programming their first and second stories of the buildings, is that really those are the types of uses that are best suited for programming in new development.
And I would say that, HPD, again, will speak to you in more detail, but thinking about making marriages and identifying uses as buildings come to them for support, when we, really expect the majority of development here to be affordable, whether that's daycare or, whatever kind of space that might be.
Yeah, I would also just sort of piggyback on that. To date, I mean, we've been in discussions with property owners and developers as we've been crafting the zoning framework and thinking about, some of the on-the-ground issues and perspectives of the markets. And we haven't talked to anyone who hasn't said, or wouldn't be first in line to have a use like that in their projects. They just see them as very stable tenants.
So the only thing I would say to that
Yeah.
point, and not specifically about the Bronx, but very often we see projects that are on city-owned land that come to us and rather late in the game, and there's a small amount of community facility, and we've heard from prior applications that there's a greater need for daycare or some other use, and that matching is perhaps more haphazard than I think some of us would like to see happen. So if there is a role in the larger community plan for making sure that happens, I think it would be very worthwhile.
That's a
A
great
space
note.
bank even.
That's a great note.
Commissioner Delauze.
First, I'm sorry that you spent such a lovely day yesterday going through this PowerPoint presentation.
And forgetting the open space slide, no less.
I'm wondering if you could go to your slide. Unfortunately, this particular one doesn't have a page number on it, but the one that, context area, so it's early on about the affordable housing and
Sure.
the mix of units in the neighborhood. It would definitely be helpful, before this comes back, to get a further breakdown on where the unregulated versus rent stabilized versus government-assisted housing stock is within the mapped area.
Sure.
That would be very, very helpful. And on the government-assisted, it would be helpful to have an idea of what the regulatory period is for those and what the ownership structure is for that. And on the rent stabilized, what the median rents are currently.
Yeah, we have.
Okay, great. Because I mean, and just the concern, I would just say, I'm sure besides the depth of affordability, which is a very real concern, especially when you have an AMI level, which is basically hovers around 30% of AMI currently. That even with improved term sheets from HPD, it doesn't mean that the vast majority of the units in a particular project in terms of new construction are going to reach the AMI levels that exist in the neighborhood. So I would assume that that's the primary concern, even with improvements that have happened. So that really leaves the existing affordable housing stock as something that needs to be preserved.
Yes, absolutely.
So having that unpacked a bit more, in addition to the legal services and tenant right to counsel, which is certainly huge improvement, making sure that we're not doing anything to incentivize the demolition of existing rent-stabilized housing is critical. So understanding where those units are relative to where we're increasing density is very, very important.
Thank you. And can I also use this opportunity, because I did not mention, but I should have, is that we are planning an open house where all of our agency partners, really the village, for lack of a better phrase, that it took to go through some of these recommendations, start to draft them, we'll be doing an open house at Bronx Museum of the Arts on Saturday, September 16th. We'll have more information available. But HPD has a tremendous amount of that information that they'll be sharing with the public, as well as feeding out through the plan as we move through this
Great.
process.
And if I just may follow up on the question from Vice Chair Knuckles about the numbers of jobs, I would actually, in addition to the numbers of jobs along the corridor, I would really like to know, and I don't know if we have this information, but what the educational background is of the folks within those jobs, because that really is the gap
Yep.
where the investment needs to focus.
Commissioner Levitt.
I'd also like to know how, a little more detail about how we imagine that the MIH program is going to work here. Because one of the premises of MIH is that no subsidy is available for developing these units. And,
Okay.
all right, let me finish my question. I guess my premise is not exactly on target, but it's understanding what market rate development might be in this neighborhood, given the relatively large amount of low-income
Yeah.
households here. Where is the market, and is the market itself
Yeah.
actually, would qualify as affordable
Yeah.
housing? And how is MIH going to, in that kind of a situation, what additional city resources are going to be needed in order to realize this? And at what point do the market forces of MIH kick in so that the private sector is contributing to the production of affordable housing?
Sure, I think that's actually a really good question, and one that I should have framed a little bit as I talked about the mapping of mandatory inclusionary housing, because that text amendment is something that we've always said is a bit of a backstop at this point, and something that we don't think people are going to be beholden to right off the bat in terms of their entire housing program, and that, in fact, a substantial amount of the housing that's developed over the foreseeable future will, in fact, require subsidy, thus be 100% affordable projects. Certainly, the permanency will be mapped into those projects, but we do think that there is some time for the market to catch up to fully cross-subsidize an MIH project on its own.
And I would just add, we have in conversations with property owners who've come forward to understand redevelopment of their property, mission-based organizations, of course, HPD, and our own understanding of the markets, our understanding that the market here for the foreseeable future is an affordable housing market, will require subsidy across the board. And in fact, in the past 10 years, 90% of the multifamily units have been subsidized housing. We expect that trend to continue. Just to reiterate what Michael was saying, MIH we really see as the backstop here. But we should have a full discussion of that.
Right, more detail when we come back at
Yeah.
next hearing would be really helpful.
Good, thank you.
Other questions from the commission? If not, this item is certified, and I thank the members of the public for the interest, and especially the council member. Thank you.
Item number 2, page 65. This is a post-referral of a minor modification of the Baltic Street Urban Renewal Plan to eliminate a 40-foot height limitation in Community District 6, Brooklyn. Our presenter is Connie Chan from the Brooklyn office. Please note for the record that Commissioner Dela-Uz is recused. We are on item number 2, page 65.
Good afternoon. This is a post-referral item for an application by the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development seeking a minor change to the Baltic Street Urban Renewal Plan to eliminate the existing 40-foot height limit for a portion of the Baltic Street Urban Renewal Area in order to facilitate a new mixed-use development comprised of commercial and residential uses, including affordable housing, in Park Slope, Brooklyn, Community District Number 6. So here is a land use map of the northern part of Park Slope. The proposed development can be seen here, outlined in the black dotted line. The development fronts along Fifth Avenue in Park Slope, which is a major commercial corridor that's zoned R6A with a C14 commercial overlay. Fourth Avenue is also located right here. It's also a major corridor in Park Slope and is zoned R8A with C24, and the mid-blocks in between 4th and 5th Avenues are zoned R6B. So the proposed development is split between two zoning district boundaries, R6A and R6B, both with the C14 commercial overlay. The urban renewal area is comprised of these two blocks, which are blocks 940 and 943, which can be seen closer here. The Baltic Street Urban Renewal Plan was approved in 1981 by the City Planning Commission. Specific urban renewal sites of interest are as follows. Sites 2A, 2B, 2C, and 2D, which are located here, were targeted for new construction of owner-occupied housing. Sites 3A, 3B, and 3C, which is the proposed development site fronting along Fifth Avenue, these are the subject of the application where the 40-foot height limit is proposed to be removed. A supermarket and accessory parking lot was built on these sites in 1983. When the urban renewal plan was adopted in 1981, this area was zoned R6, which is a non-contextual zoning district that does not cap building heights. Design controls in the urban renewal plan included a 40-foot height limit for new residential buildings in the urban renewal area. This height limitation was intended to ensure that new construction of the owner-occupied housing planned for sites 2A, 2B, 2C, and 2D would be developed in a manner that was compatible with the surrounding residential area, which consisted of low-rise housing. In 1993, as part of the Park Slope North rezoning, this area was rezoned from R6 to the contextual zoning districts that exist today in order to help ensure that future development was in context with the existing built form in the area. So the proposed minor change to the Baltic Street Urban Renewal Plan would eliminate the existing 40-foot height limit with respects to sites 3A, 3B, and 3C of the Baltic Street Urban Renewal Area in order to facilitate a new mixed-use development pursuant to the underlying zoning. The R6A district runs along Fifth Avenue within 100 feet of Fifth Avenue allows for a maximum building height of 75 feet, and the R6B district, which is located beyond 100 feet of Fifth Avenue, allows for a maximum building height of 55 feet. The proposed development consists of two buildings that are comprised of 164 units of residential use, or 126,700 square feet of floor area, 48,000 square feet of commercial floor area, and accessory parking. Pursuant to a regulatory agreement with HPD, a minimum of 25% of the residential units will be affordable to households earning between 40% and 100% of the area median income. Community Board 6 held a public hearing on June 22nd, and their executive committee voted unanimously to approve the application on July 6th. The borough president did not hold a public hearing or submit a resolution on this application.
Questions? Commissioner Dweck?
Just as the thought came to me, Barry Diniston walked in, so he always makes me think of the Fresh program. I see we're taking out a supermarket, but I can't make out the, or maybe it's just a rendering, the retail use on the base. And does this site qualify for a Fresh bonus? And
So it does not.
It does not
qualify for the fresh bonus, that's right.
got it. And maybe can you clarify for me why, just so I?
The area where you get the zoning incentive for fresh
Oh,
is.
it's not in the Fresh zoning district.
It's not, it's
Got
not,
it.
that's right,
Got it.
it's not
Okay.
mapped.
All right, that I should have known. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Other comments, questions? Then I would ask the commission for the assent to HPD's request for the modifications to the urban renewal area by a show of hands. Okay, thank you.
Could someone please bring Commissioner Delius back? Great. Next is item number 3, page 108, our first pre-hearing item, a public hearing for a site selection and acquisition of property to consolidate the existing police department warehouses to Maspeth, Queens. Our presenter, Scott Solomon, from the Queens office, item number 3, page 108.
And I would just announce before the beginning of this that I know I am not alone, that there are a few other commissioners who are anxiously waiting to go out into the ever-darkening skies. And so what I would suggest, since totality is at 2:44, that we break at 2:35, which will allow us to go out, observe it, and then continue the proceedings. As Commissioner Levin so eloquently put it, Euler stops for very little, but for a once every 100-year display of Mother Nature's power, it's worth pausing our review session.
And with that, in that spirit, I'll move on. I can do it less.
It's getting dark.
So the NYPD currently operates 6 facilities throughout the city for warehousing property. Totals currently around 500,000 square feet. Many of these facilities are currently overcrowded. Some received damage from Superstorm Sandy and still remain vulnerable to floods. Some of the items that they contain range from biological evidence to general contraband and goods. Many of these stored items have specific spatial and environmental conditions, requirements to ensure long-term preservation. So the NYPD and DCAS are proposing consolidation of these 6 facilities into one centralized, city-owned facility at 5515 Grand Avenue in Maspeth, Queens. The site is located on Grand Avenue, just west of the Long Island Railroad Montauk Branch right-of-way. Has convenient access to the Long Island Expressway. Grand Avenue itself is a major east-west arterial stretching from Williamsburg, Brooklyn, all the way out east to Elmhurst, Queens. The Q59 bus also runs along, provides local bus access. The site under review, indicated in the red outline there, contains approximately 385,000 square feet of area within 3 contiguous tax lots. For the past 90 years, it's been operating as a corrugated box factory. The operator also owns this property. These 6 interconnected buildings have access throughout the property. The company is currently planning on moving their factory to a newly constructed modern factory in northern New Jersey. Per the EDC's website, the factory does not receive any financial assistance from the New York City IDA. And the NYPD intends to enter an agreement with the current operator so that they can continue use for 24 months and as they transition to their new factory. As you see in the zoning map above, it is located in the M31 district. It is a use group 16 warehouse being proposed, and it would be developed as of right. It is not mapped within a flood zone, and it would also be within that Mazveth industrial business zone. Above is a proposed facility layout. What you see in purple is what's proposed to be demolished. What's in gray will be retained and renovated. In the rear would be a new automated storage and retrieval system with a 70-foot high ceiling. It would be 1 story. This high ceiling height is required for this type of automated retrieval system. It would allow for efficient retrieval, be temperature controlled, and will serve all precincts. Renovated spaces will be used for administrative and conventional rack storage. The total existing square footage is 296 feet now. The existing portions to be removed would be 129,000 square feet. Existing property to remain will be 167,000 square feet. Newly constructed will be 249,000 square feet, primarily in the rear where the automated retrieval system will be. And the total proposed square footage would come to 417,000 square feet. The NYPD plans to go to bid in 2019 with a contractor selected by 2020. Construction is expected to take approximately 18 to 24 months with a full move-in by 2024. And the new facility is expected to have a staff of approximately 50 employees. After being certified by the DCP on May 22nd, the community board voted unanimously to approve the application with no conditions on July 12th, and the Queens Board President issued a recommendation to approve the application with no conditions. Thank you.
Questions from the commission? Commissioner Efron.
I see the community has spoken in support of this, so I will not go into my concern about taking up space in IBZs. But I do have a question about whether or not the city will have a long-term lease or will acquire it for, will they be buying
This
it?
is going to be city-owned.
Okay, so
This
this
is
will
a
be
site
city-owned.
selection and
Right,
acquisition.
okay, which is why they can do all the construction.
It'll be as of right.
Okay, thank you.
The one thing that I will note, Commissioner Efron, because you had raised the concern before about, you and Commissioner Levin actually had raised concerns about whether this was an industrial use
Right.
or more like self-storage. And as we learned more about the nature of the use, it is both more job-intensive and more of a traditional warehousing rather than a self-storage use.
It sounds as if it actually had been production as well, so I don't know if we had the number of employees. I'm sorry, the new use.
The new use, yeah.
Thank you.
No, the prior use had been the cardboard box company.
I heard 15 will be employed, is that correct?
So 50 will be employed at the
50.
proposed facility.
50.
50, I'm sorry, I
50.
misheard you as 15. Thank
I'm
you for
sorry.
clarifying that. That actually makes a big difference.
Other comments, questions? Okay, so this will go to a public hearing on Wednesday.
Next item, item number 4, page 132, citywide pre-hearing, a proposed zoning text amendment to establish a special permit for self-storage facilities in certain manufacturing districts. Laura Smith from the Housing, Economic, and Infrastructure Planning Division will present item 4, page 132.
And apologies in advance, Laura, that we are going to interrupt you midstream.
I have to thank you for that. before I wanted to be a city planner, I wanted to be an astronaut, so this is very exciting. I get both of my dreams fulfilled today. So good afternoon, commissioners. My name is Laura Smith. Amanda Ayer is the project manager for this, but she's out today, so I'm subbing in just temporarily. I'm here to present to you the proposed text amendment to require a special permit for new self-storage facilities in certain industrial areas. This proposal aims to support industrial jobs in New York City's industrial business zones. We understand that self-storage facilities have generated concern among communities and industrial advocates. This proposal is aiming to strike a balance between protecting the city's most active industrial areas and addressing the real demand that exists in the city for self-storage, which are already limited as to where they can locate in New York City. This proposal originated in the 10-point industrial action plan, which was announced in November 2015. The Office of the Mayor and City Council together announced this 10-point action plan. It targets New York City's industrial business zones as areas for employment growth and industrial innovation. The industrial action plan specifically called out limiting personal storage and IBZs to support economic growth. The industrial uses that the city desires in IBZs are either job-intensive, innovative, provide utilities and industrial services to New Yorkers, and/or support additional economic output. Because self-storage doesn't generate many jobs, tends to serve households, and tends to site on the sites that we think are optimal for industrial businesses, we're proposing a CPC special permit for the development of new self-storage in designated areas in M zones. We think a case-by-case, site-specific review process is necessary to ensure self-storage development does not represent a significant lost opportunity for the future siting of industrial, more job-intensive businesses. Special permit considerations would include lot size, proximity to truck routes, and recent nearby industrial investments. The special permit would be required only for self-storage facilities. Other warehouses and moving companies would not require a special permit, since those businesses are typically more job-intensive and directly support industrial businesses. In designated areas in M districts, self-storage development would be permitted by special permit on sites that are not appropriate for industrial business locations. The City Planning Commission would need to find that a lot or building would be impractical for conforming industrial uses based on such considerations as zoning lot size, lot or building configuration, proximity to truck routes, the capacity of local streets providing access to the zoning lot, investment in comparable sites in the vicinity, the need for environmental remediation, the potential for conflict between potential industrial uses and existing uses in the surrounding area. Existing self-storage facilities would be permitted to remain and extend or enlarge within the original zoning lot. The proposed text amendment was referred on May 22nd of this year to 27 community boards that contain portions of designated areas in M districts. We received 11 votes in favor with no conditions, including one, Brooklyn 10, for whom the proposal was not actually referred to, but they submitted a vote in favor. 2 community boards voted in favor with conditions, 3 against the proposal, and we have not received recommendations from 12, nor have we yet received any BP recommendations.
I think the Brooklyn BP sent one in late, so.
We may have just gotten one in from them. Thank you. The concerns that we heard during public review from community boards include concern that the proposed special permit is too restrictive and does not sufficiently consider the services that self-storage facilities provide to small businesses and residents in small apartments who seek affordable and flexible storage options. And also that the restriction of self-storage in IBZs could potentially cause an increase in self-storage development in M and C8 districts outside of IBZs, which are often closer to residential areas. From the City Planning Commission, we heard concerns about how the special permit may be, how it's unclear how the special permit encourages the industrial uses that we want to promote, and also that it may be difficult for an applicant to demonstrate that they meet the findings. And then we've heard from the industry concerns that the proposal may hurt their industry and harm small businesses, and they're specifically seeking a mixed-use option and a small site exemption. An ATEX was filed on August 3rd, 2017 in response to concerns that we heard through public review. The results of the DEIS, which acknowledged the potential of the original proposed text amendment for a significant adverse impact on the self-storage industry, concerns expressed by the Planning Commission during referral regarding the findings of the proposed special permit. The ATEX would permit self-storage facilities as of right in designated areas in M districts, provided that at least 20,000 square feet of ground floor space be dedicated to manufacturing, semi-industrial, or industrial uses. It would change the originally proposed CPC special permit so that it only applies to modify or waive the industrial ground floor use requirement. We believe it gives decision makers more options and builds upon the mixed-use alternative, which was analyzed in the DEIS. However, the analysis of the mixed-use alternative proposed in the DEIS resulted in several modifications, which I'll present to you next, that we think better fulfill the purpose and need of the proposed action as the mixed-use alternative. So modifications to floor area and parking are also proposed as part of the ATEX that would facilitate the proposed set-aside for ground floor space for industrial use. The ATEX includes specifications for the ceiling heights of the required ground floor industrial space, a reduction of off-street parking and loading dock requirements associated with the required industrial ground floor space, a reduction in the dimensions of the required loading berths associated with the self-storage use from 50 to 37 feet, and an allowance for up to 20,000 square feet of the required industrial floor area to exceed the 1.0 FAR cap in M11 districts. The diagram illustrated here shows how development may be achieved on a 60,000 square foot lot. The purple area shows the required 20,000 square feet of ground floor industrial area. The yellow shows this proposed self-storage facility. Because the purple area is exempted from FAR calculations, the building is allowed to exceed the 1.0 FAR cap, enabling a second story of self-storage use. The parking and loading requirements are also reduced and minimum ceiling heights are defined here. This sums up the proposed action. A draft environmental impact statement has been completed for this proposal. The positive declaration was issued on March 1st and the public scoping meeting held on March 30th, 2017. The draft EIS chapters with the potential for significant adverse impacts include the socioeconomics chapter, with the potential for an impact on specific industries, in this case, of course, the self-storage industry. And due to the generic and almost citywide nature of the proposal, the potential for significant adverse impacts in other technical areas, including historic and cultural resources and hazardous materials, could not be ruled out entirely. So this concludes, I think I made it in just in time, and I believe we'll take questions now or after. Thank you.
Thank you. So we will reconvene here, I would say, at 2:50. I think we can now turn it over to commissioners for questions. Yes, Vice Chair Knuckles.
Laura, right?
Yes.
Do we have any idea of an approximate number of sites that would be impacted by this if it were to pass?
Okay. We projected one a year.
One a year?
One special permit a year application.
Yeah, I mean, there's no approximate total number of
Well, it would be
200,
I mean, it would
20,
be
you know.
any developable site in the designated M districts
Yeah.
would be subject to the special permit. In terms of the number of applications that we would expect to receive a year, we would expect about one a year. So I don't know that we have a number of sites that we would be,
We expected about 15 without the special permit and 10 with the special permit. So reduction, I agree with that.
Could you speak into the microphone,
Here's
please,
a-
Barry?
Yeah, sorry, Barry Dinnerstein. We projected 15 over a 10-year period without the special permit and 10 with the special permit. I don't know that we
would be
projected
without the ATEX.
without the ATEX.
Eric Coburn, it's getting a little crowded here. The ATEX is derived from the mixed-use alternative, which is in the DEIS. And the ATEX would probably have similar effects, which would be somewhere between the 10 and the 15. So it is a diminution of the reduction in the number of facilities.
Commissioner Cirillo.
Thank you. I missed the very beginning of that question, so forgive me if I'm going backwards on the questions, but I guess I'm focused a little bit on the ATEX at the moment, obviously because that's an attempt to create some flexibility. But I guess my question is this, so, and I'm sorry that I don't have the packet information, it may be in there, and I'm sure the DEIS addresses, but what is the typical, and is there a typical size, I know we think of them as large for the most part, of a storage facility? And where I'm going with the question, just to not go back and forth, just to throw it all out there, is I'm trying to understand the 20,000 square feet issue and what the reality of that impact is, because if, you know, facilities are 100,000 square feet, you're talking about 20% of the facility. If they're 50,000 square feet, I'm just trying to figure out what are we suggesting, whether or not that's practical, even though it's a threshold for flexibility, but what is the impact, and what do we know about the industry, how it functions now, the sizes of things that are out there, and the potential sizes of things in the future?
I think a sort of typical self-storage facility that gets built is on the order of 30 or 40,000 square feet.
The typical lot size, the average was about 39,000, and the median was about 50,000 square feet lot size. We did throw out, there's a couple of properties that are on very, very large lots, like there's a self-storage facility that's sitting on a Home Depot facility, which is like 10 acres, so we didn't include that as being a typical. But typical is between, the lot size is between 40 and 50,000 square feet. So the 20,000 square feet as shown there was, the idea is typical to allow someone to do 20,000 square feet on the ground floor, to have room for their lobby for self-storage, then room for parking and loading that would be required, so that the lot would, in a typical situation, would work. That's what 20,000 is.
So, I mean, unless I'm misunderstanding, we're saying it's 50%, I'm turning this a little bit into percentages, so it's 50% of a typical building would have to be reserved for manufacturing use, or,
Of a typical lot, not building.
I mean, a typical lot.
But with the FAR exemption for the 20,000 square feet that we would be requiring to be set aside for industrial space, you could exceed the 1.0 FAR cap to build the full-size self-storage facility that we would
Okay.
expect to see. So, for example, in this example, absent the floor area exemption for the industrial space, you would have a 60,000 square foot lot in this case with one FAR, 20,000 square feet of industrial with the remaining 40,000 square feet of self-storage facility. But because through the ATEX, we're proposing to exempt the ground floor mandatory industrial set-aside space up to 20,000 square feet, the self-storage facility actually isn't penalized for providing the required ground floor industrial space.
Okay, I understand that. So what is, and I don't know how the math works out in this and development options, but why did we choose to do it by square feet and not percentage?
I think Barry's just.
And again, there could be a better or worse reason for that, I don't know.
A couple of things that we were trying to do is one, there have been a number of sort of studies and focus groups looking at industrial businesses, trying to figure out, separate from this project, what kind of space industrial businesses were looking for and had trouble finding. And it was in the 15 to 30,000 square feet. That kind of space is very, very difficult to exist, to find in the city for an industrial business. So the idea here was to create a space that was a meaningful size that the market was looking for, while not necessarily burdening the self-storage people with a size that they would find difficult to build. So we chose as a first step to do 20,000, but that is subject to, we can talk about that. We wanted to create a scope to allow people to talk about what's the right size.
And so on a relatively small lot, a percentage would result in too little industrial space to really be meaningful as an addition to the supply. On a larger site, a percentage that would yield 50,000 square feet, say, of required industrial space would be setting aside for a use that the property owner or the self-storage operator would probably not be equipped to manage or find a tenant for. It's a different sort of class of industrial use that occupies a very, very large space.
Right.
And I think, our thinking in discussions with the self-storage industry, it would be sort of inappropriate to ask a self-storage operator to find a tenant for a 60,000 square foot industrial space.
So, and I realize this is a pre-hearing, and I don't want to, I know there'll be opportunity tomorrow, but the follow-up, I guess, where you're helping me to get is what happens to an owner or an operator in the circumstance where they have set aside the 20,000 square feet, they have gotten the benefit of the exemption that's created by that. I mean, dare I say, is there like a good faith marketing requirement that is in here? What is the standard by which we, and I'm assuming that would come in through a special permit for a waiver of the requirement, I mean, all those things that grow out of the process. So what do we envision the process would be? We know what we expect the development to look like, but then what follows that, and what's the criteria, what are the findings that then we're able to actually embrace to know that it's
That they've put
they
it.
can't fill it, and now they have a building with 20,000 square feet of empty space,
Well,
and then what happens?
Well, first of all, we're starting with a fairly broad range of industrial uses. So we don't believe, particularly in the IBZs, that the self-storage people would have trouble finding a tenant. It's not Soho. These are, core industrial areas, so they should be
Understood.
able to find a tenant. The ATEX changes the special permit findings so that the commission would be finding that it would be difficult for the property owner to actually provide the 20,000 square feet. So for instance, if the site was too small, they could say, well, we can't provide 20,000 square feet of space because our lot is only 20,000 square feet.
But that's in the development stage, right? I mean, that's as you're building it. I'm thinking about it's built, and you have space, and
they
you
can't
have
find
no tenant.
And they can't find a tenant. That is something that we have not contemplated.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Efron.
I guess part and parcel of the same question I had is what's enforcement? These are almost always owner-occupied self-storage, as far as my experience has been. They're not tenants, so the owner and the user is the same. Let's assume even that there was a great intention to actually lease the space and the manufacturer goes out of business. What happens then? And
I think enforcement here would be no different than enforcement for any other use, with the only sort of positive exception being that because these are in IBZs, they have IBZ administrators, and there is sort of an additional party keeping an eye on the site.
That's what I was hoping you would say. Is there a rule or regulation that corresponds to the zoning change so that the IBZ makes it clear? Or is that just incorporated because they have to abide by zoning by law?
The latter.
I think we do need to talk a little bit more about enforcement. We sort of put this together, and we wanted to get some level of public reaction. We wanted to get the ability to define a scope here, and I think we need to think about how this would be enforced and how that exactly would work.
I would just say very positively, it sounds like an interesting cross-subsidy opportunity for manufacturing space. So I think it's a really interesting idea.
Yes, Commissioner Deleuze.
I just wanted to kind of go back to the original intention for the original proposal, and have an understanding of how, if you have a sense of how that was discussed at the various community boards. Because, I mean, the vast majority voted in favor with no conditions, and at least one of the two that voted in favor with conditions, it was to actually make it even more stringent than what we were proposing. So I'm trying to understand how the ATEX came out of those conversations.
A combination. We did not, well, community boards were, for the most part, pretty supportive. Borough presidents and borough boards, while not opposed, had lots of questions and concerns that come up. we also have gotten considerable pushback from the industry. So, again, we're trying to put some things out there for discussion. We'll have a hearing, we'll see what people say, and then we'll come back and we can talk more about and make a staff recommendation.
I guess if I might, I mean, I guess I expected pushback from the industry considering what the text was, what was about, which was trying to have more job-intensive uses in industrial business zones, but while allowing the industry to build as of right in M zones and other areas. So I guess, to me, that was expected. So it would be helpful on Wednesday, and I'm sure there's representatives of the industry that are in the audience or that you'll be in contact with. It would be really helpful to have some kind of side-by-side analysis of the per jobs by square foot for self-storage versus per job by square foot versus traditional manufacturing uses. I just want to kind of get back to the original intent and have that conversation. I'm just concerned, I'm certainly open to cross-subsidy options. In general, I just want to make sure that it's leading to what we originally said, which was to try to close loopholes for certain uses in industrial zones.
Commissioner Cantor.
What's the tax situation for that up to 20,000 square foot parcel?
I'm sorry?
What's the tax situation if there's no occupancy?
Tax situation?
Yeah. Is the guy next door paying for it?
I think it would be the property owner.
Yeah.
I'm talking about real estate, I'm talking about real estate.
Yeah, well, both the storage at present and the manufacturing space would get a fairly significant tax abatement for creating industrial space. That would be, we're not changing any of that.
And supposes he creates the space and can't fill it.
Again, I'm not sure how that would affect the tax status of it. I mean, if presumably they could appeal and argue that they can't fill the space and it's over assessed, but that's, that happens, I guess, a lot.
Yes, Commissioner Levin.
I have several questions here. Let me just put two of them out. One is, could you sort of unpack for us a little bit the kinds of industrial uses that would qualify for this space? I know there are artist-related uses and what's on the list? And then my second question is, essentially we're converting this into a mixed-use development scheme. And we've tried that in a variety of other scenarios in zoning, and I wonder if there are any lessons learned from other mixed-use development scenarios that are meant to incentivize the creation of industrial space that are relevant to this application.
Sure. The use groups that would be allowed, or the uses that would be allowed in the sort of set-aside space are fairly expansive at this point. We wanted to leave them broad to set the scope, with room to, I think, refine.
But is there a plain English sort of overview of what that list of uses is? I mean, I saw the list of numbers
Essentially,
in 14A.
Semi-industrial and in industrial uses. So it ranges from actually movie production, artist studios, auto repair, warehousing, to all forms of manufacturing.
So does it include some uses that are not allowed as of right in the zone?
No. And I'm sorry, so your second question was the mixed use?
Lessons learned from other mixed-use zoning schemes that we've adopted that,
One reason for
forecast success or
insisting
not.
it be on the ground floor and insisting that it be at least 20,000 square feet is so that everyone can see what's going on in the space. It's easy to see that, they've turned the space into a restaurant. In the past, we've allowed people to do floors in buildings, and so floor 6, floor 9, and floor 12 are reserved for manufacturing, and that becomes very, very difficult to sort of enforce, to see what's going on. Our thinking here is to make it very, very clear what's happening.
And I think also because we're not expanding the range of uses that can be allowed, and these are in IBZs, where, you know, if it's not a self-storage facility, then it's another type of sort of permitted manufacturing use that you would see anywhere else throughout the area. The only thing that's changing as part of this is the restriction on self-storage, not the expansion of other uses.
Other questions? Yes, Commissioner Efron?
Question. It isn't mixed use because they're all,
Correct.
right? I mean, they're all industrial uses.
Technically, it's
M uses, right? It's just, one's a business, operating business.
it's a subset, it's a mix of a subset of industrial uses.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, and but it's putting a self-storage operator into a line of business that they may not have been in, probably haven't been in.
As a property manager.
As a property.
If they so choose to manage it, or if they, because they could easily sublet it to someone else to manage the property. So.
Yeah, but that's a feature of their business that they haven't had to wrestle with.
Although, I will say, Amanda, who is not here, has subscribed to the self-storage industry publication, which showed up today, and we were like looking at it and saying, who knew that there was a self-storage magazine? And one of the latest things that they're telling self-storage operators to deal with is a mixed development. And they have all these different scenarios. So the industry, I mean, it's probably the beginning, but the industry is getting this sort of pushback all across the country. And the operators are starting to think about putting in different types of uses to complement the storage. So.
As New Yorkers, we're always proud of being at the cutting edge. Yes, Commissioner Deloise.
Just one more question in regards to Wednesday's hearing and, you know, the industry's, the points the industry raised. One of the things that came up when we originally certified this was that there was a trend in the industry, especially in New York City, to do the pickup and then, you know, pick it up from people's places and then bring it someplace else where the land is cheaper, obviously. And so I'm just wondering, like, how big of a trend is that? How is that really changing the industry? What's the projection on that? Because that, to me, would also be helpful information.
You mean how many companies are moving out of the city?
Yeah, moving to the pickup model where they pick
So
the
to
stuff.
what extent are
in terms of
people
storage,
dropping
in
their?
terms of storage.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can ask the industry to talk to that on Wednesday.
But it's a different business. They can explain a little bit what the differences are.
Other questions? Okay, so this item will be on the public hearing on Wednesday.
Okay. Commissioners, before we get into our pre-hearing on the East Harlem project, HPD and SBS are here to present.
And I want to especially thank our colleagues from HPD and SBS for giving us this introduction to set the stage. We are joined by Layla Bozark, who is the Deputy Commissioner for Neighborhood Strategies at HPD, and Simon Kowitsky, who is the Assistant Commissioner for Neighborhood Development and Stabilization at HPD.
Hi, folks. Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. As the chair mentioned, my name's Layla Bozarg. I'm the Deputy Commissioner of Neighborhood Strategies at HPD. Before my colleagues at DCP get into the broader overall rezoning proposal, we wanted to come in and give a little bit more context to the housing strategies that we've been working on within the broader rezoning conversation. So, let's see, where am I pointing this to over here? Okay, here we go. As many of you know, the rezoning is actually part of a strategy that we've laid out in our Housing New York plan, which is the city's plan among many initiatives that we've laid out in the plan to build and preserve 200,000 units over the next 10 years. And also in Housing New York, we've kind of put a new way forward of how we want to work with and engage communities as we do work throughout the city. So, just a little bit of context, citywide right now, we are ahead of schedule of our goals of getting to that 200,000 unit goal over 10 years. 80% of what we've financed so far is reaching folks at 60% of area median income or below. And importantly, wanted to point out that 30% of what we've produced is actually already reaching that
very low income to extremely low income that we hear often as we go out in communities that folks want us to be producing at. So this is just a little bit of overall context. Feel free to ask me questions afterwards if you have any. So over the past 2.5 years, HPD has been deeply involved in the East Harlem neighborhood planning process that was convened by the Speaker, the Borough President, and Community Board 11. We attended dozens of meetings with the steering committee, the Affordable Housing Preservation and Development subgroups, community-based organizations, and residents. During these conversations, we heard many concerns, particularly around the rising cost of living, around harassment and general building maintenance and repair issues, and concerns around economic opportunity generally. We also learned that East Harlem has a lot of strengths and a place of many assets. It's got a vibrant culture, a lot of diversity, it's rich in transit and open space, and it's relatively affordable compared to other parts of Manhattan. However, to a lot of the folks that we spoke to also expressed fears of not being able to remain in the neighborhood that they love so much as it has changed over time and as it continues to change. So in addition to partaking in the East Harlem neighborhood planning process, we have conducted a lot of our own research, and I wanted to give just a little bit of context of some of how we've been looking at the neighborhood. East Harlem, as many of you know, has one of the largest concentrations of rent-regulated housing in the city, with about 75% of all homes overseen by a government agency that restricts rents. Just under a third of the entire building stock is actually owned and managed by NYCHA. And HPD has also historically played a pretty significant role in preservation and development efforts in the neighborhood. In a little over the past decade, we've constructed or preserved almost 1,400 affordable apartments. Over the past 3 years alone, 2014 to 2017, since the start of Housing New York, we've financed about 4,200 affordable homes in the district. That's about 5% of our total citywide progress to date. But as East Harlem residents have children and age in place, and families from other parts of the city and country and world are moving to New York and moving to East Harlem, the demand for housing has increased. This has put enormous pressure on the housing stock and on rents. It's important to note that between 2002 and 2014, well before any rezoning here was announced or contemplated, the median gross rents increased by approximately 40% in East Harlem. That's compared to only 24% across the city. New development has been occurring in East Harlem without any affordability restrictions, and many families in the neighborhood already can't afford market rents in the area. Overall, more than half of the households are rent burdened in East Harlem, and these graphics speak to that a little bit. So in response to these trends and the work that we've been doing in the area, we've put forward, and in response to the ideas put forward through the East Harlem neighborhood planning process, we've prepared a draft East Harlem housing plan. You should have that in your packets. So these are the 4 main focus areas of our housing plan. It really serves as a strategic document, a guiding document to ensure that our investments, our programs, and our policies are working as best as they can to address some of the expressed priorities and needs of the community and broader needs in the city. And we've met actually many times with the East Harlem Steering Committee and subgroups to ensure that what we're building into this document is incorporating their feedback, their recommendations, and it continues to be a work in progress. It's a draft plan, and we will be working to finalize it after the ULURP process. So I'll talk a little bit about each of these strategies. First, around preserving existing affordable housing. We're working on multiple fronts when it comes to preservation, because preservation doesn't mean just one thing. So we're working both on the financing end and on the enforcement end. Let's see. Go back. So, what was that? Yeah, those are our bedbug dogs. You don't want to see those around. So,
that dog gets around.
Yeah.
So over the past 3 years, one thing that I do want to mention is that HPD has been taking a much more proactive and a strategic approach to engaging building owners who might benefit from our financing and tax incentives. And in exchange for that, they agree to maintain their rents at affordable levels. We found that many building owners actually aren't aware that HPD has products for them to use. Or they have no experience working with a government agency and see that as a big barrier to entry. So we've been piloting new tactics to reach and assist these homeowners. We've had extensive outreach through mailings, calls, referrals, surveys. We're also targeting building owners with signs of distress, buildings with signs of distress, and with expiring or recently expired tax exemptions. We're targeting those on the tax lien sale who have some kind of financial distress, or those that might have some kind of greater incentive to use our programs. We also recently launched something called the Landlord Ambassadors Program with Enterprise. This program offers technical assistance and a really kind of hands-on approach to customer service to owners that are interested in trying to use our program. So again, these are much smaller building owners, tends to be smaller building owners with a little bit less capacity. The Mutual Housing Association of New York, Manny, was selected as the landlord ambassador for Upper Manhattan. We've also recently launched a new preservation marketing campaign called Let's Invest, which targets owners of smaller properties who might need help in financing repairs. We've also started holding monthly owner clinics at our offices downtown at 100 Gold Street, where owners can come in for one-on-one consultations with representatives from HPD, DOB, Department of Finance, and other partners to just get more familiar with our products and what it's like to work with us and what that might mean for their building. And these we've held 2 so far at HPD, and they've been wildly successful. We've had a lot of owners and packed rooms for these. So I think it's also worth mentioning that through the neighborhood planning process, we heard a lot about community land trusts. And as we were exploring this idea with a lot of the groups that were asking HPD to take the idea more seriously, we decided to put out a request for expressions of interest. And in July, we put that RFEI, we call it, out last year. And in July, in partnership with Enterprise, we recently awarded a $500,000 grant to the East Harlem El Barrio Community Land Trust to acquire and rehab properties, including 3 that are currently city-owned. And so they would acquire them and put them into a newly established community land trust. In addition, we're funding the New York City Community Land Initiative. They also are called NICELY, who will administer a community land trust learning and exchange to help build the capacity of some of the other groups that applied to our RFEI, but have a little bit more of a ways to go before being a fully functioning trust. So another part of our preservation strategy, as I mentioned, is really around promoting safe and healthy housing. This is really what we consider our enforcement side. The East Harlem Neighborhood Plan had called for stronger enforcement on general housing quality issues. It's also a major priority of the borough president. She's expressed that to us over time. So we're continuing to improve our housing quality through rigorous enforcement on the Housing Maintenance Code. We're improving tenant education on how to use 311, and we're encouraging organizations to refer problem buildings to us directly. Over the last year, we've prioritized what we call block sweeps in East Harlem, where our enforcement team uses referrals and data to identify problem buildings, and then we go out and we proactively not only inspect that building, but the entire block, just in case there's a pattern on that block. As of mid-July, we surveyed 426 buildings in East Harlem, with 61 warranting a full building survey following that sweep. 19 were identified as distressed, and HPD has initiated additional action, including litigation, follow-up inspections, and referrals to our enforcement programs following from these. So we're continuing to accept referrals about distressed buildings or harassment from community groups. We'll continue to monitor these buildings and others, and a lot of folks in East Harlem have commended us for this work and have asked us to continue doing it, and we're going to be doing it on an as-needed basis. So the final prong of our preservation strategy is generally around the protection of tenants. All parts of preservation is focused on existing tenants, but there is more that the city, as many of you likely know, is doing around tenant protection. So the East Harlem Neighborhood Plan called for an extension of free legal services, closer coordination on harassment issues between the community and the city and various agencies within the city, more robust tenant education, and the creation of an anti-harassment zone. So we've responded to a lot of those requests and continue to work with our partners to expand resources and networks. So as many of you know, earlier this year, the mayor announced free legal representation in East Harlem for tenants facing harassment and/or eviction, committing $4.6 million annually through 2021. We continue to work with the Tenant Harassment Prevention Task Force, which is both the city and the state and the Attorney General's office, to investigate and take action against landlords who harass tenants. We take referrals by community-based organizations, but are also using data to inform that work. We are also hosting tenant resource fairs, distributing multilingual information, and contracting with community-based groups to provide tenant education and resources that range from financial counseling to tenant organizing to legal clinics. And finally, as some of you know, we've recently wrapped up a year-long working group that was formed to explore the creation of a program modeled off the existing Certificate of No Harassment program. And we're currently doing our budgetary and cost impact evaluations for that and working on legislation to understand what it takes to get that to implementation. So I'm going to jump ahead here. In addition to our preservation strategies, which are multifold, obviously, preservation is a huge priority for us because of the impact it has on existing tenants. But we know that to accommodate a growing population and to ensure that the shortage of housing doesn't continue to drive rents even higher, we have to ensure that the overall housing opportunity also increases and that any new housing built includes hopefully permanently affordable housing. So the East Harlem Neighborhood Plan called for the exploration of further public sites for affordable housing. It called for new tools to promote permanent and deep affordability. It called for the incorporation of community, retail, and other development needs into projects, and it called for the implementation of the mandatory inclusionary housing project. So as part of our strategy for East Harlem, we're prioritizing the development of over 2,400 affordable homes on publicly owned land throughout the neighborhood. We have also committed to deeper levels of affordability at key projects. This is a photo of Sendero Verde. We also have the Lexington Gardens 2 project, where at least 20% of the homes will be deeply affordable. That's the same at Sendero Verde here. And at the 126th Street Bus Depot, we've made that same commitment to do at least 20% of the units at 30% of area median income or below. So that's about $25,770 for a family of 3. I'm going to skip over going into more detail on Sendero Verde for the sake of time, but if you do have more questions about that, we can deal with that. As I've mentioned, we are, in addition to this 2,400 units, we are looking at additional public sites that were identified in the East Harlem Neighborhood Plan and that the speaker and some of the steering committee members have brought to our attention. So that's an ongoing process, and hopefully at some point soon we'll be able to understand whether any of those we're evaluating them and looking at what it would take to move around some of the existing uses to bring some of those sites into our affordable housing development pipeline. I also want to point out that we are making reforms to our request for proposal process to ensure, and how we award those and what we are awarding when we're looking at the proposals. And some of the amendments we're making are there to ensure and reward longer-term affordability. We're ensuring longer-term public control going forward. And we've made some adjustments to make it easier for nonprofits and mission-driven developers to compete for those sites. In addition to our public sites commitments, the implementation of MIH along the major neighborhood corridors has the potential to facilitate the creation of permanently affordable housing. And that's on private sites where previous to this rezoning, we would not be able to achieve that permanent affordability. And of course, we continue to offer our financing tools. I think some of you know this, but we very recently updated our financing term sheets. So we updated the terms of our programs to require and incentivize more deeply affordable units, more homeless units as well. And we've allocated an additional $1.9 billion to our capital budget or the administration has allocated $1.9 billion to our capital budget to be able to reach those deeper levels of affordability where we can. Lastly, our housing plan describes several initiatives, which I can talk about more if you have questions, that specifically support mission-driven groups that might have land but don't have a lot of development capacity. And we're also exploring opportunities for artist housing, which is something that's been articulated by, through the community planning process. So we're almost there. In addition to our preservation and development strategies, the kind of third prong of our overall housing strategy in the neighborhood is about increasing access to the housing that we're building. We've heard a lot that there's a need to make the application process easier to understand. We've heard a lot about people needing help preparing for and completing the application process. So to that end, we've initiated a few initiatives. We've kind of beefed up and are training a lot more housing ambassadors, which are community groups that provide free technical assistance to residents who wish to apply for affordable housing. There are now 4 housing ambassadors in the East Harlem neighborhood, and we continue to recruit more. And what we do there is we bring them in and we train them. We do a deep training with them on this. And so they, in addition to our existing resources, become that added touch in the community on helping to apply and access housing. So we also created the Ready, Set, Apply brochure, which you see here, and it's in multiple languages. We created this in partnership with the Department of Consumer Affairs' Office of Financial Empowerment and the Center for Urban Pedagogy. And it really serves as a guide on how to prepare for the application process. To supplement this, we've also created a video guide on how to apply for affordable housing. We've made we've made changes to project templates to include info for those with rental subsidies. That was something we heard was confusing. If I have a Section 8 voucher, how do I apply for your housing and use that voucher? And we're also undergoing a large-scale project to redesign our entire Housing Connect system and make it more kind of user-based, user-friendly. It will still look familiar, but the way it asks questions is designed to be more kind of human-focused or user-focused. So we're also doing work to better advertise open housing lotteries. We're now doing a press announcement every time a housing lottery is open. We're using social media, multilingual information is available online, on paper, and on our website. We're also encouraging organizations to sign up for our notifications when a lottery is open so that when we send that out, they can then send that out as well. And we're sending notifications out directly to the East Harlem Housing stakeholder list now. And then lastly, I want to just mention that we do continue. Last year, we had put out some revisions to our marketing guidelines, and it's something that we continue to refine. And our marketing guidelines dictates the rules for who's eligible and how they get into our housing. So we've made some revisions to ensure that applicants are not rejected based solely on their credit score alone or their housing court history. And we continue to kind of look for ways that we can make the marketing guidelines speak even more to the needs that are out there. So the last thing I'll mention is kind of the final prong of our East Harlem housing strategy, which is around the broader need to promote economic opportunity. We know that quality employment helps residents afford quality housing, and HPD is committed to leveraging our housing investments to create job opportunities and strengthen small businesses. In partner with our sister agencies, we're implementing a host of new programs and requirements, some of which you might hear more about today. Last year, we implemented Hire NYC on HPD projects, which requires that projects receiving $2 million or more in HPD subsidy, which is most projects, to post open positions that were created by that new development or with that preservation. They have to post those new positions at the Workforce One Center system, and they have to interview qualified candidates. Also new and in response to community conversations we've had in East Harlem is our RFPs now require respondents to demonstrate a plan for targeted outreach to residents of the local community district and plans for connecting them to employment opportunities generated by the project. We've also, I think, as some of you know, expanded our opportunities for minority and women-owned businesses. In the affordable housing industry, we've ramped up what we call our MWBE Build-Up Program, which requires projects that receive $2 million or more in city subsidy to spend at least 25% of all HPD, HDC supported costs on certified MWBE construction, design, or professional service firms. And then in our RFPs, we also give preference if they bring that 25%, propose to bring that 25% even higher. To help MWBE developers better compete, HPD's new Building Capacity Workshop series introduces MWBEs and nonprofit developers to best practices in affordable housing, from site selection to project financing. We offer networking sessions and sessions on construction and property management. 2 East Harlem-based developers are graduates of the course. One is El Barrio Operations Fight Back and Carthage Real Estate Advisors. Lastly, we want to ensure that affordable housing development contributes to a healthy and diverse retail environment in East Harlem. I'm sure you'll hear a little bit more about this in a moment, but SBS, in partnership with local groups, has conducted a community district needs assessment. And we, HPD, are going to be encouraging our developers in East Harlem to consult that assessment. We give preference if they're using that assessment. And the local Neighborhood 360 partner, Union Settlement Association, in considering retail needs for the community, as well as ways to help find potential tenants. I'm now ready to take questions. I might bring some of my colleagues up to help.
What I might suggest, actually, is I think it could be helpful to get the SBS presentation, and then if we're joined by so many deputy commissioners and assistant commissioners, then to be able to have a holistic Q&A session.
I'll just end by saying this really is a work in progress for us, so we are continuing to look for all kinds of feedback and input to strengthen it and make it a truly responsive plan.
Thank you. I'll now ask our 2 colleagues from SBS. We are joined by Blaise Backer, who's Deputy Commissioner for Neighborhood Development, and Kevin Cummings, Assistant Commissioner for Workforce Development from Small Business Services.
Good afternoon. I'm not going to touch this, but I'm Blaise Backer, Deputy Commissioner for Neighborhood Development in the Department of Small Business Services. As most of you probably know from hearing me up here several times before, at SBS we aim to unlock economic potential and create economic security for all New Yorkers by connecting New Yorkers to quality jobs, building stronger businesses, and fostering vibrant neighborhoods across the 5 boroughs. And we prepare and help New Yorkers to find jobs, help businesses start, operate, and grow, and we work with community-based organizations to build vibrant neighborhoods where New Yorkers can shop, work, and live. My colleague Kevin Cummings will be joining me shortly to talk specifically about the workforce development pieces, but I did want to speak a little bit about our engagement thus far in the neighborhood. We've worked closely with East Harlem community-based organizations, merchants, and residents over the past 2 years, including during the East Harlem Neighborhood Plan process, to implement new investments that respond directly to the community's recommendations. And that's starting back in summer and fall of 2015. We participated in all of the public East Harlem meetings and economic development subgroup meetings led by Speaker Mark Viverito with community stakeholders, and provided input on economic development recommendations in advance of the East Harlem Neighborhood Plan release. We are a member of the East Harlem Community Alliance, a diverse group of neighborhood stakeholders led by Union Settlement Association, which formed out of the neighborhood planning process and continues to be a forum for feedback and potential partnership on small business, workforce, and commercial revitalization needs. And we continue to engage the Alliance and its member organizations in both the Promote East Harlem and Buy East Harlem committees through various initiatives and commitments we've implemented in this neighborhood in direct response to the recommendations from the East Harlem Neighborhood Plan. So these, the first 2 objectives here, increase quality employment opportunities for East Harlem residents and enhance the skills of East Harlem residents, which will allow them to succeed in the workforce. Kevin Cummings will be speaking to shortly. Objective 3, protect and enhance the viability of East Harlem small businesses, includes 3 recommendations I want to touch on: providing multi-year funding to establish and sustain merchant associations on East 116th and East 125th, increase funding for programs that provide assistance to local small businesses, and conduct a commercial district needs assessment along the main commercial corridors in East Harlem. And likewise with Objective 4, increase overall economic activity in East Harlem. The recommendations were to use the merchant association or bid to attract new types of businesses to open in East Harlem, provide funding for local groups to encourage local businesses, nonprofits, and other organizations to purchase goods and services within East Harlem, and take steps to enhance the safety and cleanliness of the commercial corridors by including better lighting, more waste receptacles, and more frequent sanitation pickups. With these objectives 3 and 4, what SBS has initially taken on this commitment to do a commercial district needs assessment, we launched the Neighborhood 360 program, which is essentially conducts these assessments and invests in community-based organizations to support revitalization projects in our city's commercial corridors. And through these needs assessment, which you should have one in your packet of East Harlem, essentially it looks at the existing business landscape of the neighborhood shopping corridors with community-identified strengths, challenges, and opportunities for commercial revitalization, which are on pages 4 and 5 in there. And what we did here, we provided funding and technical assistance to Union Settlement, to New East Harlem Merchant Association, or NEMA, and Hope Community to gather more than 1,000 surveys, as well as numerous interviews and workshops with neighborhood shoppers, workers, community leaders, and property owners and residents. And again, in terms of the actual geographies of these areas, this was done January to June 2016. Geography was along 125th, 3rd Avenue, 116th Street, and South 112th Street. Okay, I didn't know this was like that, sorry. Essentially through the CDNA, on those opportunities we put out there as a grant opportunity, organizations responded, and we've already committed $1.49 million in expense dollars over the next 3 years to these organizations. And again, a lot of them are listed out here, but in the interest of time, essentially these are in line with the recommendations from the neighborhood plan, including merchant organizing, marketing East Harlem's unique cultural identity, and expanding services for business owners to grow in place. The overarching goals of the Neighborhood 360 grant are to address the specific needs and opportunities of East Harlem's commercial district through high-quality local economic development initiatives, maximize program impact, and grow organizational capacity through direct investments in staff hiring. We have Union Settlement has 2 full-time staffers paid for through this grant. Encourage partnership and coordination among local community-based organizations to catalyze both short and long-term revitalization, and build out robust multi-year commercial revitalization programs and not just one-off projects. As I touched on, well, just to give maybe a couple specific projects, Visit El Barrio District Marketing Campaign is an effort underway to promote mom and pop retailers and highlight East Harlem as a destination. Merchant organizing along 116th Street to develop merchant leadership and advocate for their needs. Placemaking and public events at La Marqueta at 116th Street and 125th Street to increase foot traffic and business sales. Some business planning workshops and one-on-one technical assistance for local merchants to do digital marketing, accounting, customer service, and other services, and supplemental sanitation along 116th Street, 125th Street, and 3rd Avenue to maintain a cleaner, safer, and more welcoming shopping corridor. With that, I'm going to bring up Kevin to talk about workforce development, and then we can take questions.
Thank you, Blaze. Good afternoon. Just because of time, I can take some questions in regards to Workforce One Center if you have any.
I'll now turn it open to the commission. We thought it would be useful to have these presentations to give a sense that while we're focused on the land use actions, that both before the formal start of ULURP on the East Harlem rezoning, but continuing throughout this ULURP period, so much work has been happening on parallel and related tracks. And so that's why we thought it worth taking the time to step back. And so I would open it up to questions either on workforce development, on the housing plan, on the 360, any of the issues that have been presented. Commissioner Deloze.
Since Kevin's here, I'll start with him. I'm wondering, actually, on this slide, can you talk about which of these strategies besides the Satellite Workforce One Center in East Harlem are specific? Like, how are you tailoring them for East Harlem?
Sure. So I can speak a little bit about the workforce center, sort of the workforce system, and sort of how we leverage our network. So in speaking about the East Harlem Satellite, it would be a part of a network. We currently have 20 different Workforce One sites across the city. And interestingly, partner with those local sites to be able to connect with community partners. So when we're thinking about or discussing job opportunities, we're actually leveraging our community partners in sort of a hyperlocal way to be able to communicate what job openings there are. We also, one of my colleagues mentioned Hire NYC. For those qualified contracts, we are also communicating those job opportunities that are listed with us through those community partnership networks.
Do you already have an analysis of how many people in East Harlem are seeking jobs through your Workforce One Center or your partnerships, and what their educational and work experience background is compared to the jobs that are open? I guess I find that access to information about employment is one barrier, but the bigger barrier that I guess I've often seen is that there's a mismatch between what the employer expectations are or need is in terms of educational or work experience and the education and work experience of the folks who might be seeking the jobs.
Sure, and there's probably a couple different points I could speak to there. The first I'll say is that we're probably still in sort of the process of making sure we're finding out exactly what the needs in East Harlem will be. We are committed to having a presence there. The second piece I'll say is that I think that the Workforce One centers actually stand in the reach of making sure that we're bridging what employers need and what community members, the jobs that community members are looking for. Interestingly, the industry partnerships that you see here is actually one point that we use to leverage that. So we're pulling in executives, representatives from different corporations, different employers, and we have them on a panel, and they're embedded in our agency, really. And what we're doing is having discussions with them about what their needs are, and then trying to bridge that back to our Workforce One centers so they can communicate that to the community. And we're also providing training opportunities within those Workforce One centers so that we can actually not only just communicate job opportunities, but inform residents, including East Harlem when we target there, about what exactly they need to be able to connect to those jobs.
Mr. Cummings, you're familiar with Strive, are you not?
The local organization?
Yeah, it's based in East Harlem.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah. They're one of our community partners. That's my familiarity with them.
And their East Harlem Talent Network that they work with the Empowerment Zone and other entities in finding employment for East Harlem residents. I was just wondering where you plugged into that network.
I'm sure. So just given my recent joining SBS, I wouldn't be able to speak at length about Strive, but what I can say is that they are one of our community partners. So what that means is that whenever we have job opportunities, we actually actively receive referrals from them. But in terms of our partnership, we are communicating job opportunities to that organization. They are referring clients to us, and where they may have needs, we do also consider outbound referrals so that folks could get supportive services.
Commissioner Muddy.
My question is for Ms. Bozarth. You mentioned that under the creation of Certificate of No Harassment pilot program, you were going to model that after the existing program. Knowing that East Harlem is critically concerned about displacement, what are the, I guess, mechanisms that are going to change in the Certificate of No Harassment to ensure a more healthy and robust program for East Harlem?
So I'll answer the specific things about what changes we're proposing to the existing structure. But I also just want to mention that the Certificate of No Harassment is one tool of multiple that we have around anti-harassment. And currently, it's by no means the most effective, but we recognize its importance and are looking at ways to target it. So what we've proposed to be different about this potential pilot program is actually to use data, and that data will include some referral information to target certain areas. Sorry? Okay. To target areas rather than having it apply wholesale in its current form. We're also proposing to use and work with community groups in the process of investigation and using information that, and hopefully providing funding to community groups as well. That's part of what the recommendation that came out of the working group, to actually partake in a stage of the investigation process to bring us information. We have also proposed to streamline the existing investigation review process once it comes into HPD. I'm not sure how familiar you are, but the existing program takes very long from kind of start to finish to get to a determination. So those are kind of the key components of what would be different. So the targeting, trying to make sure we're using our resources to go to apply this where harassment is most likely to occur, and then the streamlined process and using more community-based information in the investigations. But I also just want to mention that, you know, our preservation work, the existing anti-tenant harassment prevention task force will be ongoing. The legal services, those are all key components that we consider to a broad anti-harassment strategy.
Commissioner Cobb.
Thank you. This is really more, I think, an SBS question, but as we look at the East Harlem rezoning, 96 blocks, major changes in zoning, one piece of that seems underrepresented in terms of potential city investment that seems to come under SBS would be the 125th Street Metro North Station and its opportunity as a potentially huge 24-hour small business opportunity if there were certain things that were done, and recognizing that it's not entirely the city's responsibility, but there are ways in which the city could be engaged, including policing. The zoning may be doing its part, but there are other operational aspects. Could you just talk a little bit about the city's commitment to making that a seriously third transportation opportunity, if not potentially the first, given its regional aspects?
So I guess, I mean, what I can speak to is certainly, again, the space there at 125th, sort of under the station. I mean, that's where our partners are playing a role. NEMA in particular has been involved for some time with DOT specifically on creating a public space there in one of their pedestrian plazas and really activating that space. So NEMA, both through funding from us as well as funding from DOT and from the Speaker's office, has been playing a larger role there. To kind of augment that space, make it safer, make it more active, again, through programming, through supplementary sanitation, I think a better security presence. So I think, you know, they're understanding that that's an obvious no there for people who come to the community and are using it for transit purposes. I think DOT, my understanding is continuing to put resources to that organization to ensure it's better maintained. To the facility itself as a sort of a transit hub, I'm not sure if that's what you're speaking to. I can't necessarily speak to that.
Oh, right, I mean, that's somewhat outside of the jurisdiction of SBS, but any sense of the financial commitment the city's putting behind that area, I think would really go a long way to helping us understand its potential, since the zoning in particular around that area is creating considerably more density, and how the small businesses would really benefit from that. I may be asking too much in this particular session, but it was an opportunity to really express.
I think it'd be, in terms of expense dollars, I think.
And also it can come out during the public hearing as well.
Yeah, but I think we could probably, again, between ourselves and DOT through the Plaza program, could probably at least come up with a cumulative sort of expense dollars put towards that. I don't know about the capital.
Yeah, and also just how the city would roll out more of a 24-hour late-night opportunity there, given that there is some degree of concern of people coming into that station because it is so quiet at night.
Sure.
Yes, Commissioner Deleuze.
I'm going to switch to HPD if that's okay. First, I appreciate that the plan is underway, and I like the new highlights that you added to the presentation. I'm just wondering, and it seems as though, I think with slide number 4, with the pie chart with the grid, it seems to be, it's helpful information, the breakdown of the types of units in the neighborhood, and to the extent that HPD is now standardizing how it's looking at the mix of units of housing, you know, government-assisted, NYCHA, rent-regulated, unregulated in districts. I know, and I'm sure you have, another layer of detail, which I think would be very helpful, at least to me, if not to others in the conversation. Just, you know, what are the median rents in the rent-stabilized housing stock? On the government-assisted, you know, where are they at in the regulatory period? You know, how close to expiration are we? How many of those that are government-assisted are nonprofit versus for-profit owned? All of it about kind of getting to, you know, what are the risks that we need to think about and to be planning for or mitigating as part of this process. And I know especially in neighborhoods where there's a really significant percentage of NYCHA housing, it would be really helpful to know the age of those properties and the capital needs that exist in those properties, so that that's part of the understanding of the preservation conversation. You know, I certainly have a fear that if we don't do more to invest in those, that, you know, people will eventually have to move out because the conditions are so bad in some properties, despite incredible advances in that area. So that would be really helpful, and then to match that up, honestly, with the income and affordability, to know, like, where are the people at various incomes living, to know what is the true level of risk for displacement. You know, like, I personally evaluate the risk differently if someone is living in an unregulated or rent-stabilized, owned by for-profit, for instance, then, you know, that's very low income versus someone living at NYCHA. So it'd be really helpful to understand that, and to the extent that that can be part of an ongoing part of how HPD and the department presents information to the commission, I would find it really helpful. And then we'd really need to know the name of the dog. Who's figuring who's...
I think that's Nemo.
Is Roscoe too?
That's
Oh, so
Nemo.
it's Nemo? Okay.
Yeah, Nemo. Yeah.
In the Jerome Avenue presentation, we were wondering which was cuter, the guy testifying with the baby or the dog. It was a tie.
Right. And then, you know, I also just want to say that I think the outreach that the department is doing to property owners, you know, on existing HPD programs is really helpful. And it would just be helpful to know, like, and you said the 2 sessions that you had at 100 Gold were wildly successful. It'd be great to know overall, like, is there a target that exists in the neighborhood about how many property owners we'd like to reach, how many of those units we want to bring under regulation? It would be helpful to know that. And then what level of, quite honestly, outreach or investment is required to get to that target?
Yeah. I'd say we don't have just to start with the end,
Yeah.
we don't have a target right now, but it's something we have been talking about. We don't want to measure our success just by how many owners show up. That's certainly an interim measure of success. We definitely want to know, you know, are these sessions then leading to things that we were able to bring into our pipeline? Because we've just kicked off the owner clinics, that's something that's still in conversation. You know, so I'd say a lot of it fits into our broader preservation targets. As I think one of the slides had shown, we have been doing a lot of preservation work, especially under the past 3 years in the area. So we haven't broken down our broad citywide preservation goal into just an East Harlem one, but it is an area that we've been very focused in. But I take your point that we should be setting up kind of a sense of what success looks like on the outcomes. And we will definitely work to get as much of this data to you as we can. I'll just note that, you know, because this is stuff we obviously want to look at internally as well, not just to share with the commission, but one of the challenges that we've found is just the being able to make the apples to apples comparison with the data and the level of data that we're able to have. So we know how many NYCHA units there are in the neighborhood. But we can't get to that level of granularity in the rezoning neighborhood when it comes to just incomes and median rents. So we often end up comparing kind of apples to oranges. It's still helpful, but that's why sometimes we're hesitant to put that type of information on an official slide in case it does become misleading. But it's something that we continue to work with our research unit to figure out what the best way is to look at it.
Yes, Commissioner Knight.
So just building upon the question that Commissioner Delauze had with respect to the market side of the equation, can you give us a sense of what market rents are in East Harlem? And then looking at this growth between 2014 and 2017, can we get a sense of what the number of market rate units that were brought to market?
Yeah, the market rate units that were brought in that same time period, I'll have to get back to you on, but if we could just note that question. In terms of market rents right now, this isn't, we should verify the right source for this, but in our research, we found that market rents are currently on average $2,700 for an apartment and about $3,000 for new construction. So that's average rents in the neighborhood. But we should figure out the right source on that and follow up.
Yes, Commissioner Levin.
While you're here, I just wanted to acknowledge what a complete new package of information this is for HPD to be bringing to us at this point. I'm sure there are lots of, it's easy for everybody to be a critic, and I know we're going to hear a lot of criticism at the hearing on Wednesday. But this is a big improvement over the level of information that we usually get, and I'm really delighted that you're working on all these things and bringing them to us. I think it's clear to me that preservation and preserving existing tenants and existing buildings is one of the key issues here. We're going to have to figure out how we balance the amount of new density that we're allowing. We're creating new market forces or feeding new market forces in the neighborhood. And the existing affordable housing is a precious commodity, and we have to be sure that we're not doing too much to push it out of whack. And I also just wanted to acknowledge that your discussion of the tenant preservation for this review of harassment is a sea change by HPD. We've had other rezonings where we've gotten very strong public comment about the importance of doing that, and we've gotten resistance from HPD about its efficacy. And the fact that you're even looking into it and considering it, I think, is an enormous change that should be acknowledged.
Thanks. Thanks. And I just want to thank the team for putting this information together for you all. It was actually their idea to get this level of detail in front of you, so.
I want to echo Commissioner Levin's words. The support, the cooperation, the collegiality with our partners at HBD and SBS are an integral part of having this be a comprehensive plan and not just a rezoning action. So thank you all very, very much. I'll note for the commissioners that we are now out of the eclipse land, so we can return back to normal order, but we do have to face a reality check, which is we have, our next two items are significant items, the East Harlem neighborhood rezoning, and then also the Sendero Verde project, and after that, we have 7 private applications. So with alacrity, we will now move to the East Harlem neighborhood.